The catastrophic conflict that would consume a generation of heroes and reshape the ancient world began not with mortal ambition, but with divine vanity and a single golden apple. At the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis, the sea nymph who would later bear Achilles, the goddess Eris, arrived uninvited, her presence immediately poisoning the celebratory atmosphere. Known as the personification of strife and discord, Eris carried with her an object that would prove more destructive than any weapon forged by mortal hands, a golden apple inscribed with the words "to the fairest." The apple's placement among the wedding gifts created an immediate crisis among the assembled Olympian goddesses. 3 deities stepped forward to claim the prize: Hera, queen of the gods and protector of marriage; Athena, virgin goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare; and Aphrodite, embodiment of love and beauty. Each goddess possessed legitimate claims to supreme beauty, and their competing assertions threatened to tear apart the divine hierarchy that maintained cosmic order. Zeus, recognizing the impossibility of making such a judgment without incurring the eternal wrath of 2 powerful goddesses, declined to arbitrate the dispute. Instead, the king of the gods delegated this dangerous responsibility to a mortal Paris, also known as Alexandros, a prince of Troy who was then living as a shepherd on Mount Ida. Paris had been exposed as an infant following a prophetic dream that foretold he would bring destruction to his native city, but had survived and grown into a young man of exceptional beauty and pastoral simplicity. His selection as judge represented Zeus's calculated attempt to distance himself from the inevitable consequences while maintaining plausible neutrality in divine politics. The 3 goddesses appeared before Paris on the mountainside, each presenting compelling arguments for their superior beauty. However, the contest quickly evolved beyond a mere physical appearance into a complex negotiation involving divine bribes. Hera offered Paris dominion over all of Asia and Europe, promising him unprecedented political power and territorial control. Athena pledged to grant him wisdom and skill in warfare, guaranteeing victory in every battle and the strategic acumen to become the greatest military commander of his generation. Aphrodite, understanding the desires of a young man's heart, offered something more immediately appealing: the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris's decision to award the apple to Aphrodite established the fundamental divine alignment that would define the Trojan War. Hera and Athena, spurned and humiliated, became implacable enemies of Troy and its people, while Aphrodite committed herself to protecting Paris and ensuring he received his promised reward. This divine schism created supernatural forces that would manipulate mortal events, turning what might have been a localized conflict into a decade-long catastrophe involving the entire Greek world. The woman Aphrodite had promised Paris was Helen, daughter of Zeus and Leda, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. Helen's beauty had become legendary throughout the Greek world, described in terms that transcended mere physical attractiveness to approach divine perfection. Her marriage to Menelaus had been the culmination of an extraordinary courtship process that involved virtually every eligible prince and king in Greece, creating a web of political obligations that would prove crucial to subsequent events. Helen's abduction or elopement with Paris remains one of history's most debated questions, with ancient sources presenting conflicting accounts that reflect different cultural attitudes toward female agency and martial honour. Homer's Iliad suggests a complex scenario where Helen experiences genuine remorse for her actions, implying some degree of willing participation in her departure from Sparta. She refers to herself as shameless and evil-minded, language that suggests conscious choice rather than victimization. However, other ancient sources, including Euripides and later commentators, present her as an unwilling victim of divine manipulation, emphasizing Aphrodite's supernatural compulsion and Paris's violation of guest friendship obligations. The historical reality likely involved elements of both accounts. Paris arrived in Sparta as a diplomatic guest, received according to the sacred laws of hospitality that governed relationships between royal houses. During his extended stay, he and Helen developed a relationship that culminated in their departure together, along with substantial Spartan treasure. Whether this departure constituted abduction, elopement, or divine compulsion became less important than its political consequences, which provided Menelaus and his allies with legitimate grounds for military action under both divine law and human custom. The foundation for the massive Greek response to Helen's departure had been established years earlier through the Oath of Tyndareus, one of the most significant political agreements in Greek legendary history. Tyndareus, Helen's mortal father, had faced the daunting challenge of selecting a husband for his extraordinarily desirable daughter from among dozens of powerful suitors without triggering a civil war among the rejected candidates. His solution demonstrated remarkable political sophistication and foresight. Rather than simply choosing a husband and risking violent retaliation from disappointed suitors, Tyndareus required all candidates to swear a binding oath before the gods. Each suitor pledged to respect Helen's choice of husband and, more crucially, to come to the aid of her chosen spouse if anyone should attempt to steal her away or harm their marriage. This oath created a defensive alliance that transformed Helen's marriage from a private arrangement between two individuals into a matter of collective Greek security. The list of oath-takers reads like a catalogue of Bronze Age Greek nobility and included virtually every significant military leader who would later participate in the Trojan expedition. Odysseus of Ithaca, Ajax of Salamis, Diomedes of Argos, Palamedes of Nauplia, and dozens of other princes and kings bound themselves to this agreement. Even Agamemnon, though not a direct suitor, became involved through his family connections and political interests. The oath's binding nature derived not merely from social custom but from religious sanction, making violation tantamount to blasphemy against the gods who witnessed the pledge. When Paris and Helen departed Sparta, Menelaus immediately invoked this oath, transforming a personal grievance into a pan-Hellenic obligation. The scattered Greek kingdoms, despite their frequent mutual hostilities and competing interests, found themselves legally and religiously bound to support Sparta's demand for satisfaction. This mechanism converted what might have remained a localized dispute between Sparta and Troy into the massive military undertaking that would become the Trojan War. Agamemnon's role as leader of the resulting coalition reflected both his family relationship to Menelaus and his position as the most powerful king in Greece. As ruler of Mycenae and overlord of the Argolid, Agamemnon commanded resources and military forces that exceeded those of any other Greek leader. His fortress palace at Mycenae, with its massive cyclopean walls and sophisticated administrative systems, served as the natural headquarters for organising a campaign of unprecedented scale and complexity. The assembly of Greek forces involved far more than simple military obligation. Each participating kingdom brought its own political agenda, territorial ambitions, and economic motivations to the enterprise. The expedition offered opportunities for plunder, territorial expansion, and enhanced prestige that appealed to aristocratic warriors seeking to establish their reputations and increase their wealth. Troy's strategic position controlling access to the Black Sea and its rich trade networks made it an attractive target for Greek merchants and raiders, who had long coveted access to the region's resources. Archaeological evidence from sites like Pylos, Tiryns, and Mycenae reveals the sophisticated administrative apparatus required to organise such an expedition. Linear B tablets document the complex logistics of provisioning armies, manufacturing weapons and equipment, and coordinating naval transport. The scale of preparation required suggests that the historical Trojan War, if it occurred, represented the largest military undertaking of the late Bronze Age, requiring unprecedented cooperation among normally competitive Greek kingdoms. The religious dimension of the expedition provided additional legitimacy and motivation for participants. The violation of guest friendship laws represented an offence against Zeus Xenios, protector of hospitality, while the oath-breaking involved blasphemy against multiple deities. Greek warriors could thus frame their participation in terms of divine service and religious duty, elevating what might otherwise appear as mere aggression into sacred obligation. The coalition's diversity reflected the complex political landscape of Bronze Age Greece. where dozens of independent kingdoms maintained precarious relationships through marriage alliances, trade agreements, and mutual defence pacts. Contingents arrived from across the Greek world. Crete contributed ships and bronze-working expertise. The islands provided experienced sailors and marines, while mainland kingdoms supplied heavy infantry and charioteers. Each group brought distinct fighting traditions, equipment and tactical preferences that would need integration into a coherent military force. Agamemnon's challenge involved not merely commanding this diverse army, but maintaining unity among leaders accustomed to independent authority. The political tensions inherent in such an arrangement would repeatedly threaten the expedition's cohesion, as prideful kings chafed under unified command and competed for honour and plunder. The seeds of internal conflict that would nearly destroy the Greek cause were thus present from the coalition's inception, embedded in the very structure of Bronze Age political relationships. The transformation of scattered oath-bound contingents into a unified invasion force required more than political agreements and shared grievances. As Greek ships began converging on the harbour of Aulis in Boeotia during the spring sailing season, Agamemnon faced the monumental task of organising the largest military expedition the ancient world had yet witnessed. The narrow bay, protected from the harsh Aegean winds by the island of Euboea, provided an ideal staging ground for the massive fleet, but the concentration of so many warriors, ships and supplies created unprecedented logistical challenges that would test every aspect of Bronze Age military organisation. The harbour at Aulis quickly transformed into a sprawling military camp that stretched along the coastline for several miles. Rows of black-hulled ships, their bronze-reinforced prows gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, lined the beaches in carefully organised formations that reflected the complex hierarchy of the Greek coalition. Agamemnon's Mycenaean vessels occupied the central position, their larger size and more elaborate decorations marking them as the flagship contingent. Surrounding these core forces, the ships of allied kingdoms arranged themselves according to political relationships and military protocols that had been negotiated through months of diplomatic correspondence. The catalogue of ships, preserved in the second book of the Iliad, provides extraordinary detail about the composition and organisation of this massive force. Modern scholars recognise this section as potentially the oldest surviving portion of the epic, possibly based on actual Bronze Age records that documented the expedition's participants. The catalogue reveals a Greek world far more complex and politically sophisticated than later classical sources suggest, with nearly 30 distinct regions contributing forces under their own commanders, while acknowledging Agamemnon's supreme authority. From the Peloponnese came the expedition's core strength. Menelaus led 60 ships from Lacedaemon, their crews drawn from the warrior communities that surrounded Sparta and the fertile valleys of the Eurotas River. These Spartan forces brought with them a reputation for disciplined fighting and unwavering loyalty that would prove crucial during the siege's darkest moments. Diomedes of Argos commanded 80 ships filled with warriors from the eastern Peloponnese, men experienced in the constant border warfare that characterized relationships between the region's competing kingdoms. His contingent included skilled chariot fighters and bronze workers whose expertise in metallurgy would prove invaluable for maintaining weapons and equipment during the extended campaign. Nestor of Pylos, despite his advanced age, contributed 90 ships from the western Peloponnese. His forces represented some of the most experienced warriors in the coalition, veterans of previous conflicts who understood siege warfare and naval operations. Pylos itself served as a major administrative centre, as evidenced by the extensive Linear B archives discovered at the site, and Nestor's contribution included not only fighting men, but also the scribes, accountants and logistics specialists necessary for managing a long-term military campaign. The island contingents brought specialised naval expertise that proved essential for maintaining Greek control of the sea routes between the homeland and Troy. Ajax of Salamis led 12 ships from his strategic island position near Athens, providing crews experienced in amphibious operations and coastal raiding. The Cretans under Idomeneus contributed 80 ships from the Mediterranean's most sophisticated maritime civilization, bringing advanced knowledge of navigation, shipbuilding, and naval tactics that had been developed through centuries of trade and exploration. Odysseus arrived from Ithaca with 12 ships carrying warriors from the Ionian Islands, whose intimate knowledge of Western Greek waters and sailing conditions would prove valuable for maintaining communication with the homeland. His relatively small contingent reflected the limited resources of his island kingdom, but Odysseus himself brought diplomatic and strategic skills that made him indispensable to the expedition's leadership. His reputation for cunning and problem-solving had already been established through his role in recruiting Achilles and resolving various pre-war disputes among the coalition members. The northern Greek contingents represented some of the expedition's most formidable fighting forces. The two Ajaxes, Ajax Telamonios of Salamis and Ajax Oileos of Locris, commanded warriors from regions that had been hardened by constant warfare with Thracian and other northern peoples. These forces brought different fighting traditions that emphasized individual prowess and aggressive tactics, contrasting with the more disciplined formations favoured by southern Greek armies. Achilles' eventual recruitment from Syros added a crucial element to the coalition's military strength, though his participation required careful negotiation and came with prophetic warnings that cast a shadow over the entire enterprise. Thetis, his sea-nymph mother, had attempted to prevent his involvement by disguising him among the daughters of King Lycomedes on the island of Syros. Her efforts reflected divine knowledge of the fate that awaited her son, a prophecy that offered him a stark choice between a long, obscure life and a brief existence crowned with eternal glory. The prophecy concerning Achilles encapsulated the fundamental tension between individual survival and heroic achievement that defined aristocratic warrior culture. Thetis had learned from the fates that her son could choose between two destinies. He could remain at home and live to old age in comfortable obscurity, or he could join the Trojan expedition and die young but achieve imperishable fame. This divine revelation placed both mother and son in an impossible position, forcing them to weigh the natural desire for life against the cultural imperative for glory that dominated Bronze Age aristocratic values. Odysseus and Diomedes undertook the mission to Syros after receiving intelligence about Achilles' location. Their approach demonstrated the sophisticated intelligence networks that operated throughout the Bronze Age Greek world, as well as the diplomatic skills required to navigate sensitive political situations. Lycomedes had agreed to shelter Achilles partly from friendship with Peleus, and partly from desire to avoid entanglement in the developing conflict, making the recruitment mission diplomatically delicate. The famous story of Achilles' detection among Lycomedes' daughters, while possibly legendary embellishment, reflects real aspects of Bronze Age warrior culture and gender roles. According to tradition, Odysseus arrived at the court disguised as a merchant, offering gifts of jewellery and fine clothing alongside weapons and armour. When a trumpet sounded an alarm suggesting enemy attack, Achilles instinctively reached for the weapons, revealing his true nature and identity. Whether historical or mythical, this account emphasises the cultural assumption that warrior instincts could not be permanently suppressed or disguised. Achilles' decision to join the expedition, despite knowing the prophetic consequences, established him as the embodiment of heroic values that prioritised eternal fame over personal survival. His choice resonated throughout Greek culture as the ultimate expression of aristocratic honour, demonstrating willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of achieving legendary status. This decision also created the psychological framework for his later conflicts with Agamemnon and other coalition leaders, as someone who had already accepted death for glory could not easily compromise on matters of honour and recognition. The addition of Achilles and his Myrmidons to the coalition significantly enhanced its military capabilities. The Myrmidons, drawn from the region around Phthia in southern Thessaly, represented one of the most elite fighting forces in the Greek world. Their training emphasised individual combat skills and unit cohesion that made them particularly effective in the type of warfare expected around Troy's fortified walls. Achilles himself brought not only exceptional personal fighting ability, but also tactical innovation and leadership qualities that would prove crucial during the siege's most critical moments. Before the massive fleet could depart for Troy, diplomatic protocols required attempts at peaceful resolution of the conflict. The expedition's legitimacy under both divine and human law depended partly on demonstrating that military action represented a last resort after exhausting diplomatic alternatives. Menelaus and Odysseus undertook an embassy to Troy that served multiple purposes, formally demanding Helen's return, assessing Trojan defences and political situation, and providing legal justification for subsequent military action. The embassy's composition reflected careful diplomatic calculation. Menelaus possessed the moral authority of the wronged husband, making him the natural spokesman for Greek grievances. His presence emphasized the personal nature of the injury and the coalition's commitment to supporting his legitimate claims. Odysseus brought diplomatic expertise and negotiating skills that would be essential for navigating the complex political environment of Troy, where multiple factions might hold different views about Helen's status and the appropriate response to Greek demands. The ambassador's reception at Troy revealed the political divisions that would ultimately contribute to the city's downfall. Priam, the aged king, reportedly favoured returning Helen to avoid devastating warfare, recognising that Troy's survival depended on maintaining peaceful relationships with its neighbours. However, Paris and his supporters argued that surrendering Helen would represent unacceptable weakness and established dangerous precedents for foreign interference in Trojan affairs. The younger generation of Trojan leaders, including Hector, found themselves caught between family loyalty to Paris and strategic concerns about the city's long-term security. The embassy also provided Greek intelligence operatives with their first detailed assessment of Trojan defences and military capabilities. Troy's massive walls, constructed from precisely fitted stone blocks that rose to heights of nearly 30 feet, presented formidable obstacles to any besieging force. The city's position on a hill overlooking the Dardanelles provided natural defensive advantages while controlling access to the crucial waterway connecting the Mediterranean with the Black Sea. These observations would prove vital for planning the siege tactics that the Greeks would employ during the subsequent decade of warfare. The diplomatic mission's failure, while perhaps inevitable given the political pressures operating on both sides, provided the legal and moral justification necessary for launching the military expedition. Greek law and custom required that injured parties seek peaceful redress before resorting to violence, and the embassy's rejection by Troy satisfied this requirement. The refusal also demonstrated Trojan intransigence that could be presented to wavering coalition members as evidence of their enemies' unreasonable attitude and unwillingness to provide satisfaction for legitimate grievances. As diplomatic efforts collapsed and military preparations intensified, the assembled forces at Aulis faced a crisis that threatened to destroy the expedition before it could begin. Contrary winds prevented the fleet from sailing, trapping nearly 1,000 ships and 50,000 warriors in increasingly crowded and unsanitary conditions. The delay created mounting logistical problems as food supplies dwindled and disease began spreading through the overcrowded camps, while political tensions among the coalition leaders intensified as they debated alternative strategies and questioned Agamemnon's leadership. The crisis reached its climax when the seer Calchas revealed that the adverse winds resulted from divine displeasure. Artemis, virgin goddess of the hunt and protector of wild animals, had taken offence at some action or statement by Agamemnon that demonstrated disrespect for her authority. The specific nature of Agamemnon's offence varies among ancient sources, with some suggesting he had boasted of superior hunting skills, while others indicate he had killed a sacred deer or violated sanctuary regulations. Regardless of the precise cause, Calchas declared that the goddess demanded a terrible price for allowing the expedition to proceed: the sacrifice of Agamemnon's eldest daughter Iphigenia. This demand placed Agamemnon in an impossible position that tested every aspect of his leadership and personal character. As a father, he naturally recoiled from the thought of killing his own child, particularly for the sake of what many coalition members viewed as his brother's personal grievance. As a king, he understood that refusing the sacrifice would likely result in the expedition's collapse, undermining his political authority and leaving the oath-bound coalition in chaos. As supreme commander, he faced the prospect of explaining to 50,000 warriors that their months of preparation had been wasted because he valued family sentiment over military necessity. The sacrifice of Iphigenia marked the end of Greek innocence and the beginning of a conflict that would consume an entire generation. As favourable winds finally filled the black sails of nearly 1,000 ships, the massive fleet departed Aulis carrying warriors who had already witnessed the terrible price their gods demanded for victory. The crossing to the Troad took 3 days of steady sailing across the wine-dark waters of the northern Aegean, with experienced navigators using coastal landmarks and stellar observations to guide the unwieldy armada toward the beaches below Troy's towering walls. The initial landing near the mouth of the Scamander River faced no organised resistance, as Trojan forces had withdrawn behind their massive fortifications to await the siege they knew must come. Greek advance scouts had identified suitable beaching areas during previous reconnaissance missions, allowing the fleet to arrive in organised formations rather than the chaotic mass landing that might have resulted from hasty improvisation. The ships were drawn up on the sandy shore in carefully planned arrangements that reflected both tactical considerations and the complex political hierarchy of the coalition. Establishing the Greek camp required engineering expertise that demonstrated the sophisticated military organisation of Bronze Age armies. The fortified enclosure that protected the beach ships and housed the besieging forces stretched for nearly 2 miles along the coast, encompassing an area roughly equivalent to a major city. Massive earthworks topped with wooden palisades created defensive perimeters that could withstand Trojan counterattacks while providing secure bases for offensive operations. These fortifications included multiple gates positioned to allow rapid deployment of forces, watchtowers that provided observation of both land and sea approaches, and internal roadways that facilitated movement of supplies and personnel. The camp's internal organisation reflected the delicate balance of authority that Agamemnon needed to maintain among his allied commanders. Each major contingent received designated areas proportional to their contribution of ships and men, with the most prestigious positions near the centre reserved for the expedition's primary leaders. Agamemnon's own quarters occupied the camp's heart, surrounded by the tents and pavilions of his Messenian followers and the coalition's administrative apparatus. Menelaus established his Spartan forces nearby, emphasizing family solidarity and shared commitment to the war's primary objective. Achilles and his Myrmidons received a position at one end of the camp that provided both honour and strategic flexibility. This location allowed the coalition's most formidable fighting force to operate somewhat independently while remaining integrated into overall defensive plans. The arrangement also reflected political realities, as Achilles' semi-autonomous status required accommodation that other commanders might have resented if applied to themselves. His camp became renowned for its organisation and discipline, with Myrmidons maintaining equipment and training regimens that exceeded the standards observed elsewhere in the Greek forces. The logistical challenges of maintaining 50,000 warriors and support personnel in a hostile environment required unprecedented organisational sophistication. Daily food requirements alone demanded constant supply operations that strained the expedition's resources and required careful coordination with allied cities throughout the Greek world. Ships arrived regularly from various homeland ports, carrying grain, wine, olive oil, and preserved meat. But these supplies needed protection from Trojan raiders and careful distribution to prevent hoarding or favouritism among different contingents. Water supply presented particularly complex problems, as the natural springs near the coast could not support such large concentrations of people and animals. Greek engineers constructed elaborate systems of wells, cisterns and aqueducts that channeled fresh water from sources several miles inland, creating infrastructure projects that rivaled those of major cities. These water systems required constant maintenance and protection, as Trojan forces repeatedly attempted to cut supply lines, or poison sources that supported their enemies. Medical services demanded attention that reflected both the immediate needs of combat casualties and the long-term health challenges of maintaining large armies in relatively confined spaces. Greek physicians, trained in traditions that combined practical surgery with religious healing practices, established treatment centres throughout the camp that could handle everything from battle wounds to epidemic diseases. The concentration of so many people from different regions created ideal conditions for spreading illnesses that individual communities might have resisted, requiring quarantine procedures and preventive measures that tested contemporary medical knowledge. The first major engagement occurred within weeks of the landing, as Trojan forces under Hector's command attempted to drive the invaders back into the sea before their positions could be fully consolidated. This battle established tactical patterns that would characterise much of the subsequent warfare, with Greek heavy infantry formations confronting Trojan chariot attacks supported by allied contingents from throughout Asia Minor. The fighting demonstrated that neither side possessed decisive advantages in equipment, training, or tactical doctrine that would allow quick victory. Hector's assault concentrated on the Greek left flank, where newer arrivals had not yet completed their fortifications. Trojan chariots, drawn by carefully bred horses and manned by aristocratic warriors trained from childhood in mobile warfare, swept down from the elevated ground around the city in coordinated attacks designed to break Greek formations before they could establish defensive positions. The bronze-tipped spears and recurved bows used by Trojan forces proved equally effective as Greek weapons, while their intimate knowledge of local terrain provided significant tactical advantages. The Greek response revealed both strengths and weaknesses in their coalition structure. Individual contingents fought with remarkable courage and skill, particularly elite units like the Myrmidons and Ajax's Salaminian Marines, but coordination between different groups proved difficult under combat conditions. Language differences, varying tactical traditions, and personal rivalries among commanders created communication problems that Trojan forces learned to exploit through rapid maneuvers that prevented effective Greek counterattacks. This initial battle also introduced the crucial role that divine intervention would play throughout the conflict. Multiple gods actively participated in the fighting, with Athena providing tactical guidance to Greek commanders while Apollo inspired Trojan resistance and protected key leaders from mortal wounds. These supernatural influences created unpredictable battlefield conditions, where apparent Greek victories could suddenly reverse through divine interference, while Trojan advantages might evaporate when hostile deities intervened on behalf of their favoured mortals. The psychological impact of divine involvement extended beyond immediate tactical effects to influence long-term strategic planning and morale. Warriors on both sides understood that their ultimate fate depended not merely on human skill and courage, but on maintaining divine favour through proper religious observances and avoiding actions that might offend powerful deities. This religious dimension added layers of complexity to military decision-making, as commanders needed to consider supernatural as well as purely tactical factors when planning operations. Following the initial engagement, both armies settled into siege warfare patterns that would dominate the next 9 years. The Greeks lacked sufficient forces to completely surround Troy's massive perimeter, allowing the city to maintain communication and supply lines with allies throughout the region. Instead of attempting a tight blockade that exceeded their capabilities, Greek strategy focused on controlling key approaches to the city while conducting raids against Trojan allies and supply sources. These raiding operations became the war's dominant feature during its middle years, as Greek forces launched expeditions throughout the Troad and beyond to capture supplies, slaves, and treasure, while denying resources to their enemies. Achilles led many of these raids, establishing a reputation for both military effectiveness and ruthless treatment of captured enemies. His expeditions targeted cities like Lyrnessus, Pedasus, and Thebe, wealthy communities that provided Troy with agricultural products, manufactured goods, and military support. The capture of Lyrnessus exemplified both the tactical sophistication and brutal consequences of these raiding operations. Located approximately 20 miles south of Troy, the city served as a major supply depot and administrative centre for Trojan forces operating in the southern Troad. Its fortifications, while substantial, could not withstand concentrated assault by experienced Greek forces supported by siege equipment and tactical expertise developed during years of warfare. Achilles' assault on Lyrnessus began with careful reconnaissance that identified weak points in the city's defences and assessed the strength of its garrison. Greek engineers constructed siege ladders, battering rams, and protective screens that allowed attacking forces to approach the walls under cover while undermining defensive positions. The actual attack combined multiple approaches simultaneously, preventing defenders from concentrating their limited forces effectively. The city's fall after 3 days of fighting provided the Greeks with substantial plunder, including gold, silver, bronze weapons, and hundreds of captives who would serve as slaves or potential ransom sources. Among these prisoners was Briseis, daughter of a local priest, whose exceptional beauty made her a particularly valuable prize. According to established customs governing the distribution of booty, Achilles claimed her as his personal share, beginning a relationship that would later become central to the epic's dramatic development. Similar raids against other Trojan allies created a cumulative economic and military impact that gradually weakened the city's ability to sustain prolonged resistance. The loss of agricultural production from captured territories forced Troy to rely increasingly on supplies from more distant regions, creating logistical vulnerabilities that Greek naval forces could exploit. The capture of skilled craftsmen and military specialists deprived Trojan forces of expertise needed for maintaining weapons, equipment, and fortifications under siege conditions. However, these Greek successes came at significant costs that accumulated over time to create serious problems for the besieging forces. Extended raiding operations required substantial manpower that reduced the forces available for maintaining siege lines around Troy itself. The constant warfare created casualties that could not easily be replaced, as reinforcements from Greece arrived irregularly and often lacked the experience and training of veteran warriors. The psychological toll on Greek forces became increasingly apparent as the siege entered its middle years. Warriors who had expected a brief campaign followed by triumphant return to their homeland found themselves trapped in an endless cycle of violence that offered no clear prospect of resolution. Homesickness became a persistent problem that affected morale and discipline, particularly among contingents from distant regions who had minimal direct interest in recovering Helen or punishing Troy. Letters and messages from home, carried by supply ships and diplomatic missions, brought news of political changes, family deaths, and economic problems that demanded attention from absent kings and nobles. Some commanders faced challenges to their authority from rivals who argued that prolonged absence demonstrated weakness or incompetence. These domestic pressures created incentives for individual leaders to seek rapid resolution of the conflict, even at the cost of compromising overall Greek strategy. The breakdown of military discipline became evident in various ways that threatened the coalition's effectiveness. Disputes over the distribution of plunder led to violent confrontations between different contingents, requiring Agamemnon's personal intervention to prevent open warfare among supposedly allied forces. Desertion rates increased as individual warriors slipped away from camp to return home, taking with them valuable equipment and knowledge of Greek tactical plans that could benefit enemy forces. Religious observances, crucial for maintaining divine favour and army morale, became increasingly difficult to maintain under siege conditions. The constant demands of military operations left little time for elaborate festivals and sacrifices that normally marked important religious occasions. Priests and seers who accompanied the expedition struggled to interpret divine signs and omens in ways that supported continued military action, as many supernatural indicators suggested growing divine displeasure with the prolonged conflict. The Trojan defenders faced parallel challenges that created internal tensions threatening their resistance. The city's population, swollen by refugees from captured territories, strained food supplies and sanitary facilities beyond their designed capacity. Overcrowding created ideal conditions for epidemic diseases that could devastate the defending forces more rapidly than direct military action. The constant threat of Greek raids prevented normal agricultural activities, forcing a reliance on increasingly expensive and unreliable supply sources from distant allies. Priam's advanced age created succession questions that complicated Trojan political unity. While Hector's military leadership remained unquestioned, his authority over civilian administration and diplomatic policy faced challenges from other royal family members and noble factions. Paris, whose actions had initiated the conflict, found his political influence declining as the war's costs became apparent, but his supporters continued to argue against any compromise that might be interpreted as admission of wrongdoing. The involvement of Trojan allies from throughout Asia Minor created additional political complications that Greek intelligence services learned to exploit. Different allied contingents possessed varying levels of commitment to Troy's cause, with some participating primarily from fear of Greek retaliation rather than genuine loyalty to Priam's government. These political divisions created opportunities for Greek diplomatic initiatives designed to detach allies from the Trojan coalition through bribes, threats, or promises of favourable treatment. Divine intervention continued to prevent decisive victories by either side, as competing deities maintained roughly balanced support for their chosen mortals. When Greek forces achieved significant tactical advantages, pro-Trojan gods like Apollo and Aphrodite intervened to protect key defenders or inspire successful counterattacks. Conversely, Trojan successes triggered responses from Athena, Hera, and other pro-Greek deities who provided supernatural assistance that prevented complete Greek defeat. This divine balance reflected the broader cosmic politics that had initiated the conflict through the judgment of Paris. The gods' competing interests in the war's outcome prevented any single faction from achieving overwhelming advantages that might end the fighting quickly. Instead, divine intervention served to prolong the conflict by ensuring that neither side could deliver a knockout blow that would force their enemies to surrender or withdraw. The war's middle years established patterns of attrition warfare that gradually weakened both sides without providing clear strategic advantages to either. Greek control of the sea prevented complete Trojan victory, while the city's massive fortifications made direct assault prohibitively expensive for the besieging forces. This military stalemate created conditions that would eventually require new approaches to break the deadlock that had consumed nearly a decade of warfare. The 10th year of the siege began with an ominous portent that would shatter the fragile equilibrium maintaining Greek unity. A priest of Apollo named Chrysis approached the Greek camp during the early morning hours, his white robes and sacred fillets marking him as an inviolable religious figure under the laws governing warfare between civilized peoples. The old man carried the golden staff of his office, adorned with ribbons and symbols sacred to the far-shooting god, while behind him walked a small procession of temple servants bearing the substantial ransom he hoped would secure his daughter's freedom. Chryseis, the priest's daughter, had been captured during a recent raid on the coastal town of Chryse, where her father served as Apollo's chief priest at one of the god's most ancient and revered shrines. Her exceptional beauty and noble bearing had immediately marked her as a prize worthy of the expedition's supreme commander, and Agamemnon had claimed her as his personal share of the spoils according to the established customs governing the distribution of captured wealth and prisoners. The king of Mycenae had grown genuinely fond of his captive, praising her skills in weaving and household management, while declaring that she surpassed even his legitimate wife Clytemnestra in both beauty and accomplishment. Chryses prostrated himself before Agamemnon's tent in the formal manner required when approaching a foreign monarch, spreading his arms wide to display the golden vessels, precious fabrics, and other treasures he'd brought as ransom payment. The assembled Greek commanders watched in respectful silence as the elderly priest delivered his carefully rehearsed appeal, invoking both human compassion and religious obligation in his plea for his daughter's return. His words carried the weight of divine authority, as Apollo's priest possessed the power to bless or curse military enterprises according to their treatment by mortal rulers. The ransom offered exceeded the normal price for even the most valuable captives, reflecting both the priest's desperation and his temple's considerable wealth. Golden cups crafted by master artisans, silver tripods suitable for offering sacrifices to the gods, bolts of purple-dyed cloth worth their weight in precious metal, and carefully wrought bronze weapons demonstrated the economic resources that major religious centres could mobilise when their interests were threatened. The treasure's display created murmurs of appreciation among the watching Greeks, many of whom recognised that accepting such payment would provide substantial benefits for the expedition's treasury. Agamemnon's response revealed the dangerous pride that had been growing throughout his years of supreme command over the coalition's fractious elements. Rather than conducting the negotiations with diplomatic courtesy appropriate to dealing with a priest of Apollo, the Mycenaean king delivered a harsh public rebuke that demonstrated his contempt for both the ransom offer and the suppliant's religious status. He declared that Chryseis would remain in his household until old age claimed her, serving his pleasure in Mycenae far from her homeland and father, and threatened violent punishment if the priest dared approach the Greek camp again with similar requests. The brutality of this rejection shocked even hardened warriors accustomed to the casual cruelties of siege warfare. Greek religious tradition demanded respectful treatment of priests and suppliants, while practical military considerations suggested that maintaining positive relationships with local religious authorities could provide valuable intelligence and political advantages. Agamemnon's public humiliation of Chryseis violated both sacred custom and strategic wisdom, demonstrating the corruption of judgment that extended military command could produce in even experienced leaders. Chryseis withdrew from the camp with the dignity befitting his sacred office, but his departure carried ominous implications for the entire Greek enterprise. As he walked along the shore of the wine-dark sea, the aged priest raised his hands toward heaven and delivered a formal curse that invoked Apollo's protection for his servant and punishment for those who had wronged both father and daughter. His prayers carried across the water with the authority of decades spent in faithful service to one of Olympus's most powerful and vengeful deities. Apollo's response came with the terrible swiftness that characterized divine retribution in the ancient world. The god descended from Olympus during the night following his priest's humiliation, his silver bow singing with supernatural power as arrows of plague struck the Greek camp with devastating precision. The divine missiles first targeted the army's animals, the horses, mules and oxen whose labour supported military operations, causing them to sicken and die in numbers that created immediate logistical crises for the besieging forces. The plague's progression from animals to humans followed patterns that ancient peoples recognised as unmistakably supernatural in origin. Unlike natural diseases that spread gradually through populations, according to predictable patterns of contagion, Apollo's pestilence struck with selective fury that spared some individuals, while devastating others without regard for age, physical condition, or previous exposure to illness. The god's arrows carried death that manifested as burning fever, wasting weakness, and painful swellings that resisted all attempts at medical treatment. Greek physicians, trained in healing traditions that combined practical surgery with religious ritual, found their skills useless against divine punishment that transcended mortal understanding. The remedies that normally proved effective against battlefield injuries and common illnesses, herbal preparations, surgical procedures and purification ceremonies, provided no relief for victims of Apollo's wrath. Temple healers from various contingents attempted elaborate sacrificial rituals designed to appease the angry god, but these offerings only seemed to intensify the plague's virulence. The epidemic's impact on military operations became catastrophic within days of its onset. Units that had maintained discipline and effectiveness throughout 9 years of siege warfare found themselves reduced to skeletal strength as warriors succumbed to disease or became too weak to bear arms. The constant need to dispose of corpses and care for the sick consumed resources and manpower that could no longer be devoted to maintaining pressure on Trojan defences. Guard duties, patrol operations and raiding expeditions had to be curtailed as available personnel dwindled below minimum operational requirements. The psychological effects of divine punishment proved even more devastating than its immediate physical consequences. Warriors who had faced human enemies with courage and determination found themselves helpless against supernatural forces that could strike without warning or apparent logic. The random nature of the plague's victims destroyed confidence in traditional protective measures, as neither martial skill nor religious observance seemed to provide reliable defense against Apollo's arrows. Morale collapsed as rumors spread through the camp that the gods had abandoned the Greek cause entirely, possibly in response to some unknown transgression that had forfeited divine favor. Seers and priests from various contingents offered conflicting interpretations of the supernatural signs, creating confusion and panic among troops already demoralized by their apparent helplessness against divine retribution. Some warriors began deserting their posts to seek passage home on supply ships, while others turned to desperate religious practices that included human sacrifice and self-mutilation. On the 9th day of the plague's ravages, Achilles took the initiative to address the crisis that threatened to destroy the Greek expedition before Trojan forces could deliver the final blow. His decision to call a general assembly of the army reflected both his status as the coalition's most prestigious warrior and his growing frustration with Agamemnon's failure to provide effective leadership during the emergency. The son of Peleus possessed sufficient political authority to convene such meetings independently, a privilege that reflected his semi-autonomous position within the coalition's command structure. The assembly convened in the open space at the camp's centre, with representatives from all major contingents gathering despite the risks that public meetings posed during an active epidemic. Achilles stood before the crowd wearing full battle armour that emphasised his martial authority. The bronze plates of his corselet and the horsehair plume of his helmet catching the morning sunlight in displays of reflected glory that reminded observers of his legendary prowess. His physical presence commanded immediate attention, even from warriors who might question his political judgment or resent his privileged position. Achilles' opening address demonstrated the rhetorical skills that complemented his military abilities, as he framed the crisis in terms that appealed to both practical concerns and religious obligations. He acknowledged the obvious reality that continued divine punishment would destroy the expedition more effectively than any Trojan military action, while emphasizing that the army's survival depended on identifying and correcting whatever transgression had triggered Apollo's wrath. His speech avoided direct criticism of Agamemnon's leadership while making clear that immediate action was required to prevent complete disaster. The assembly's response to Achilles' call for religious consultation revealed the desperate state to which the plague had reduced Greek morale. Warriors who normally displayed skepticism toward prophetic pronouncements now demanded immediate access to seers and priests who might provide guidance for appeasing the angry god. The crowd's mood combined religious terror with growing anger toward leadership that had failed to prevent or resolve the crisis, creating political tensions that threatened to fracture the coalition's unity. Calchas, the expedition's chief seer and interpreter of divine will, initially hesitated to provide the explanation that the assembly demanded. His reluctance reflected both genuine fear of Agamemnon's reaction and professional caution about delivering prophecies that might prove politically explosive. The seer's reputation depended on maintaining credibility with all factions within the Greek leadership, and revealing divine displeasure with the supreme commander's actions could destroy his usefulness as a mediator between human and supernatural concerns. Only after Achilles provided explicit guarantees of personal protection did Calchas agree to reveal the true cause of Apollo's anger. The seer's public declaration that the plague resulted from Agamemnon's treatment of crises created an immediate political crisis that threatened to destroy what remained of Greek unity. By naming the supreme commander as responsible for the army's suffering, Calchas transformed a religious emergency into a direct challenge to established authority that demanded immediate resolution. Agamemnon's response to this public accusation revealed the extent to which years of supreme command had corrupted his judgment and inflamed his pride. Rather than accepting responsibility for his actions and seeking appropriate remediation, the king of Mycenae launched into a furious denunciation of both the seer and the warrior who had provided him protection. His speech demonstrated complete inability to distinguish between personal desires and collective welfare, as he complained bitterly about the prospect of losing his favourite concubine while ignoring the death that his stubbornness had caused throughout the army. The Supreme Commander's declaration that he would return Chryseis only if provided with equivalent compensation from another leader's share of plunder created the direct confrontation with Achilles that would define the epic's central conflict. This demand violated fundamental principles governing the distribution of spoils that had been established at the expedition's beginning and maintained throughout 9 years of successful cooperation. By threatening to confiscate prizes that had been legitimately awarded to other commanders, Agamemnon demonstrated the arbitrary exercise of power that transformed leadership into tyranny. Achilles' response to this threat reflected both personal outrage and principled opposition to the abuse of authority that endangered the entire coalition's stability. His argument that Agamemnon had already received the largest share of plunder from every successful operation, despite contributing less to actual fighting than many subordinate commanders, resonated with warriors who had observed the Supreme Commander's growing arrogance and self-indulgence. The son of Peleus positioned himself as defender of established customs against arbitrary power that threatened every leader's legitimate rights. The escalating exchange between Supreme Commander and Principal Warrior quickly transcended the immediate dispute over Chryseis to encompass fundamental questions about authority, honour and justice that lay at the heart of aristocratic warrior culture. Agamemnon's insistence on his prerogatives as coalition leader conflicted with Achilles' equally valid claims to recognition and respect based on superior military contributions and personal prowess. Neither position could be easily dismissed, as both reflected legitimate aspects of the political relationships that held the Greek forces together. Agamemnon's ultimate decision to claim Briseis as compensation for returning Chryseis represented a calculated insult that struck at the core of Achilles' identity and status within the warrior community. Briseis had been awarded to Achilles as recognition for his capture of Lyrnessus and his leadership during numerous successful raiding operations. Her confiscation by Supreme Command authority violated the established protocols that protected individual commanders' legitimate prizes while demonstrating Agamemnon's willingness to abuse his position for personal satisfaction. The public nature of this humiliation intensified its impact on Achilles' honour and reputation among his peers. Bronze Age warrior culture placed enormous emphasis on public recognition of individual achievement, with tangible rewards like captured women serving as visible symbols of prowess and divine favour. The arbitrary confiscation of such prizes threatened the entire system of incentives that motivated aristocratic warriors to risk their lives in pursuit of glory and material gain. Achilles' withdrawal from active participation in the siege represented more than personal pique or wounded pride. His decision reflected a fundamental breakdown in the reciprocal obligations that bound coalition leaders together in pursuit of common objectives. If Supreme Commanders could arbitrarily confiscate legitimately won prizes, then individual warriors had no incentive to continue risking their lives for collective benefit. The son of Peleus transformed his personal grievance into a principled stand that challenged the entire basis of Greek military cooperation. The immediate consequences of Achilles' withdrawal became apparent as soon as Trojan scouts reported the absence of Greek forces' most formidable fighting unit. Hector quickly organised probing attacks designed to test whether the Myrmidons' departure had created exploitable weaknesses in Greek defensive positions. These initial assaults revealed that no other Greek unit possessed the combination of individual skill and tactical coordination that had made Achilles' forces so effective in previous engagements. The psychological impact on Greek morale proved even more devastating than the loss of military capability. Warriors throughout the coalition recognised that Achilles' departure reflected fundamental problems with leadership and command authority that threatened everyone's security and prospects for success. If the expedition's greatest hero could be driven away by arbitrary treatment, then no subordinate commander could feel secure in his position or confident in his rewards for faithful service. The withdrawal of Achilles from active combat created a power vacuum that reverberated through both mortal and divine realms, setting in motion a complex web of supernatural politics that would determine the war's trajectory. Thetis, the sea nymph mother of Achilles, had witnessed her son's humiliation from her underwater palace beneath the Aegean waves, her divine nature allowing her to perceive the full scope of injustice that mortal eyes might dismiss as mere military discipline. Her maternal fury combined with her status as one of the most influential minor deities in the Olympian hierarchy, creating opportunities for intervention that would fundamentally alter the balance of power between Greeks and Trojans. The relationship between Thetis and Zeus carried historical weight that extended far beyond typical divine politics. During the early days of Zeus's reign, when other Olympians had plotted to overthrow his authority through a conspiracy involving Hera, Poseidon, and Athena, Thetis had summoned the 100-handed giant Briareus to defend the king of the gods. Her intervention had preserved Zeus's throne and earned his eternal gratitude, creating a debt of honour that the supreme deity could not easily refuse when circumstances demanded repayment. This ancient obligation provided Thetis with leverage that few other immortals could claim when approaching Zeus with requests that might conflict with his broader political interests. Thetis ascended from her marine realm during the pre-dawn hours, her passage through the dark waters leaving trails of phosphorescence that marked her divine nature. She materialized on the summit of Mount Olympus as Zeus sat apart from the other gods, contemplating the complex political calculations that governed his approach to the Trojan conflict. The timing of her approach demonstrated sophisticated understanding of divine psychology, as she chose a moment when Zeus would be alone and therefore more susceptible to personal appeals than formal petitions delivered in the presence of other deities who might object to preferential treatment. The sea goddess prostrated herself before Zeus's throne in the elaborate ritual manner required when approaching the supreme deity, her silver hair flowing across the golden pavement as she assumed the posture of complete submission. Her appeal combined maternal desperation with political sophistication as she reminded Zeus of his debt while carefully framing her request in terms that aligned with his broader interests. She asked not for direct intervention on behalf of the Greeks, which might have triggered opposition from pro-Trojan deities, but rather for temporary Trojan success that would demonstrate Achilles' value to the coalition that had spurned him. Zeus's agreement to Thetis's request created immediate complications within the divine hierarchy that had maintained rough equilibrium throughout the war's first 9 years. His promise to honour the sea goddess by allowing Trojan forces to achieve significant victories necessarily implied corresponding setbacks for Greek forces supported by other Olympian deities. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon had invested considerable divine prestige in Greek success, making Zeus's commitment to temporary Trojan advantage a direct challenge to their interests and authority. The king of the gods attempted to manage these competing divine loyalties through a carefully orchestrated assembly that would establish new rules governing supernatural intervention in mortal affairs. He summoned all major deities to gather in the great hall of his palace, where golden columns supported a roof that gleamed with celestial fire, creating an atmosphere of overwhelming divine majesty that emphasized his supreme authority. The assembled gods arranged themselves according to complex protocols that reflected their relative status within the Olympian hierarchy, with senior deities like Hera and Poseidon occupying positions of honor, while minor gods and personified abstractions took places appropriate to their lesser rank. Zeus's decree forbidding direct divine intervention in the Trojan conflict represented an attempt to prevent the supernatural escalation that might transform a regional war into cosmic catastrophe. He recognized that unrestricted divine participation could easily spiral beyond mortal comprehension, with competing deities employing increasingly destructive powers that might devastate entire regions or upset fundamental natural laws. The prohibition aimed to preserve both the war's essentially human character and the broader stability of the relationship between divine and mortal realms. The supreme deity's announcement that any god who violated this prohibition would face exile from Olympus and eternal punishment demonstrated the seriousness with which he viewed the potential consequences of unrestricted divine warfare, Zeus possessed sufficient power to enforce such threats against individual deities, though doing so would require him to overcome the combined opposition of multiple Olympians who might unite in defence of their collective interests. The political risks inherent in such confrontations provided strong incentives for maintaining the divine neutrality that his decree attempted to establish. However, the fundamental contradiction between Zeus's promise to Thetis and his prohibition against divine intervention created immediate tensions that proved impossible to resolve through formal declarations. The king of the gods had committed himself to ensuring Trojan success, which necessarily required supernatural assistance that violated the neutrality he simultaneously demanded from other deities. This logical inconsistency provided justification for other gods to interpret his prohibition selectively, honouring its letter while violating its spirit through indirect interventions that advanced their preferred outcomes. The first major violation of Zeus's decree occurred within hours of its proclamation, as Athena and Hera began coordinating efforts to counteract the pro-Trojan intervention that the supreme deity's promise to Thetis required. The goddess of wisdom employed her particular expertise in strategic planning to identify opportunities for assisting Greek forces, without engaging in the direct battlefield intervention that Zeus had explicitly forbidden. Her approach emphasized providing tactical intelligence and inspiring strategic insights that allowed mortal commanders to make better decisions without obvious supernatural assistance. Athena's intervention took the form of prophetic dreams and divine inspiration that guided Greek leaders towards more effective military strategies. She appeared to various commanders during their sleep, assuming the appearance of trusted advisors or respected elders whose counsel would carry natural authority. These nocturnal visitations provided crucial intelligence about Trojan defensive preparations, suggested tactical innovations that exploited enemy weaknesses, and reinforced morale among leaders who had begun questioning their ability to achieve victory without Achilles' participation. Hera's approach to circumventing Zeus's prohibition demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of the political dynamics that govern divine relationships. Rather than engaging in direct military intervention that might provoke immediate retaliation, the Queen of the Gods focused on manipulating the emotional and psychological factors that influenced her husband's decision-making processes. She recognized that Zeus's commitment to honoring Thetis created vulnerabilities that could be exploited through carefully orchestrated seduction and misdirection. The elaborate seduction scene that Hera orchestrated represented one of the most psychologically complex episodes in ancient literature, combining genuine marital intimacy with calculated political manipulation. The Queen of the Gods understood that Zeus's divine nature made him susceptible to certain forms of influence that mortal rulers might resist, particularly those involving the fundamental forces of desire and pleasure that governed relationships between immortal beings. Her plan required careful preparation that involved obtaining magical assistance from Aphrodite, whose expertise in matters of love and seduction provided essential elements for the deception. Hera's request for Aphrodite's magical girdle created an unusual alliance between deities who normally maintained competitive relationships. The Queen of the Gods approached the goddess of love with a fabricated story about reconciling estranged mortal spouses, carefully concealing her true intention to seduce Zeus for political purposes. Aphrodite's willingness to provide the requested assistance reflected both her natural inclination to promote romantic relationships and her incomplete understanding of the broader political context that would give Hera's actions their true significance. The magical properties of Aphrodite's girdle enhanced natural attractiveness to irresistible levels, while simultaneously clouding the judgment of those who encountered its wearer. This divine artifact had been crafted during the earliest days of creation, when the fundamental forces of attraction and desire had been given tangible form through supernatural craftsmanship that transcended mortal understanding. Its power operated on psychological levels that affected even divine consciousness. creating emotional states that overrode rational calculation and strategic thinking. Hera's transformation through the girdle's influence created a version of herself that combined her natural divine beauty with supernatural enhancement that made resistance virtually impossible. She arranged her hair in elaborate styles that emphasized her status as Queen of Heaven while adorning herself with jewelry and clothing that highlighted her physical attractiveness. The combination of magical enhancement and careful presentation created an appearance that would overwhelm Zeus's political calculations through the sheer force of desire and romantic nostalgia. The location chosen for this seduction reflected Hera's understanding of her husband's psychological vulnerabilities and preferences. Rather than approaching Zeus in the formal settings of his throne room or the council chambers where political considerations remained paramount, she selected a secluded grove on Mount Ida, where natural beauty and privacy would create an atmosphere conducive to romantic intimacy. The site's distance from Olympus reduced the likelihood of interruption by other deities while providing a setting that recalled their earliest courtship during the golden age of their relationship. Zeus's immediate response to Hera's appearance demonstrated the effectiveness of her preparation and the power of Aphrodite's magical assistance. The supreme deity, despite his vast experience with divine politics and his natural suspicion of his wife's motives, found himself overwhelmed by desire that transcended rational analysis. His passionate declaration that Hera's current beauty exceeded even her appearance during their secret courtship revealed the depth of emotional impact that her carefully orchestrated presentation had achieved. The physical consummation of their renewed intimacy occurred on a bed of clouds that Zeus created through his meteorological powers, surrounded by golden flowers and protected by a mist that concealed their activities from other divine observers. This supernatural bower provided both privacy and symbolic significance, as it recalled the cosmic forces of fertility and regeneration that the union represented within the broader framework of divine relationships. The earth itself responded to their passion by producing flowers and vegetation that demonstrated the life-giving power of their combined divine energies. The magical sleep that overcame Zeus following their lovemaking represented the crucial element in Hera's plan to neutralize his oversight of the Trojan conflict. This supernatural slumber differed qualitatively from normal rest, as it involved the temporary suspension of the cosmic awareness that normally allowed the king of the gods to monitor events throughout the mortal world. The depth of this divine sleep created a window of opportunity during which other deities could intervene in human affairs without triggering immediate detection and punishment. Poseidon emerged as the primary beneficiary of Zeus's temporary incapacitation, seizing the opportunity to provide direct assistance to Greek forces that had been struggling against Trojan advances. The god of earthquakes and the sea possessed both the motivation and capability to influence battlefield conditions in ways that would restore Greek military effectiveness without requiring the obvious supernatural intervention that might immediately alert Zeus upon his awakening. His approach emphasized environmental manipulation that could appear natural while providing crucial tactical advantages to the forces he favored. The Earthshaker's intervention began with subtle geological adjustments that improved Greek defensive positions while creating obstacles for Trojan offensive operations. Minor earthquakes shifted the terrain around the Greek camp, creating natural barriers that channeled enemy attacks into predetermined killing zones where defensive advantages could be maximized. These changes appeared to result from natural geological processes, providing plausible deniability that would protect Poseidon from accusations of violating Zeus's prohibition against direct intervention. Poseidon's manipulation of coastal conditions provided additional advantages for Greek naval operations that had been suffering from Trojan efforts to disrupt supply lines and communication with the homeland. The god of the sea created favourable winds and currents that accelerated the arrival of reinforcements and supplies, while simultaneously hampering Trojan attempts to coordinate with their own maritime allies. These meteorological changes fell within Poseidon's natural sphere of authority, making them difficult to distinguish from ordinary weather patterns that might favour one side or the other through natural coincidence. The psychological impact of renewed divine favour became apparent immediately, as Greek commanders recognised the improved conditions that surrounded their military operations. Warriors who had been demoralised by Achilles' withdrawal and the apparent abandonment of their cause by the gods suddenly found themselves operating in circumstances that suggested restored supernatural support. This revival of confidence translated into improved battlefield performance that exceeded what might have been expected from purely material advantages. The complex interplay between divine manipulation and mortal agency created battlefield conditions where the outcome of individual engagements depended on factors that transcended purely human skill and courage. Warriors on both sides found themselves influenced by supernatural forces that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness, inspiring tactical decisions and combat performance that exceeded normal capabilities. These divine influences created unpredictable battle conditions where apparent disadvantages could suddenly reverse through interventions that appeared natural but reflected careful supernatural orchestration. The temporary Greek resurgence that resulted from this divine assistance demonstrated the extent to which supernatural politics influenced mortal affairs throughout the ancient world. Battles that had seemed destined for Trojan victory suddenly shifted in favour of Greek forces, who fought with renewed determination and tactical effectiveness. Individual warriors achieved feats of prowess that exceeded their previous capabilities, while unit coordination improved dramatically as divine inspiration enhanced natural military skills. However, the fundamental tension between fate and free will remained unresolved despite these divine interventions, as the gods themselves remained bound by prophetic destinies that limited their ability to alter predetermined outcomes. Zeus's promise to Thetis had been made within the context of broader cosmic patterns that would ultimately determine the war's conclusion, creating constraints that prevented even supreme divine authority from completely overriding the fate that governed both mortal and immortal actions. The temporary advantages gained through divine deception represented tactical successes within a strategic framework that remained fundamentally unchanged by supernatural manipulation. The divine machinations that had temporarily shifted battlefield advantage toward the Greeks created conditions where individual warriors could achieve the moments of supreme glory that defined heroic culture in the Bronze Age world. These aristeia, periods of extraordinary martial prowess where heroes transcended normal human limitations, became the war's defining episodes, transforming ordinary combat into legendary encounters that would inspire poets and warriors for generations. The temporary withdrawal of Zeus's direct oversight allowed mortal champions to display their full capabilities without immediate divine interference, creating a stage where human excellence could flourish under the watchful eyes of partisan deities who provided subtle assistance to their chosen favourites. Diomedes of Argos emerged as the first beneficiary of these changed circumstances, his natural fighting abilities enhanced by Athena's careful intervention that stopped just short of violating Zeus's prohibition. The son of Tydeus had already established himself as one of the expedition's most reliable commanders during 9 years of siege warfare, but the goddess of wisdom recognised that his tactical intelligence and personal courage could achieve extraordinary results if provided with appropriate supernatural support. Her assistance took the form of enhanced perception that allowed Diomedes to distinguish between mortal enemies and the gods who sometimes walked among them on the battlefield, knowledge that would prove crucial during the extraordinary day of fighting that established his reputation as the war's most audacious hero. The battle began at dawn when Trojan forces under Hector's command launched a coordinated assault designed to exploit the perceived weakness created by Achilles' absence from Greek ranks. The attack concentrated on the left flank of the Greek defensive line, where units from various allied contingents had been positioned to guard against exactly this type of flanking maneuver. Trojan chariots swept down from the elevated ground around the city in formations that demonstrated the sophisticated tactical coordination that Hector had developed during years of defensive warfare against Greek raiding operations. Diomedes responded to the Trojan assault by organising a counterattack that combined the disciplined formations favoured by Argive military tradition with the tactical flexibility required for fluid battlefield conditions. His forces included veteran spearmen who had served in numerous previous engagements, their bronze-tipped weapons and layered linen armour representing the highest quality equipment available to Greek warriors. The unit's cohesion reflected years of training and combat experience that had welded individual fighters into an effective tactical instrument capable of complex manoeuvres under battlefield stress. The initial clash between Diomedes' forces and the advancing Trojans demonstrated the tactical sophistication that characterized Bronze Age warfare at its highest level. Trojan charioteers attempted to break Greek formations through rapid charges that combined the shock effect of horse-drawn vehicles with the individual prowess of aristocratic warriors who dismounted to engage in personal combat. Greek defenders countered with coordinated spearwork that created overlapping fields of bronze points designed to disable horses and force enemy champions into disadvantageous fighting positions. Diomedes distinguished himself immediately through a combination of tactical awareness and personal fighting skill that exceeded even the high standards expected from elite commanders. His spearwork demonstrated the precision that came from decades of training in the gymnasium and on the battlefield, each thrust calculated to exploit gaps in enemy armour or defensive positioning. His shield work showed equal mastery as he used the bronze-faced circle of oxhide not merely for protection, but as an offensive weapon that could deflect enemy attacks while creating opportunities for counterstrikes. The son of Tydeus achieved his first major success when he encountered Pandarus, the skilled archer from Lycia, whose bow had been crafted from the horns of a wild ibex and whose arrows had claimed numerous Greek lives during previous engagements. Pandarus had positioned himself on a slight rise that provided excellent fields of fire across the battlefield, his vantage point allowing him to target Greek commanders and disrupt their tactical coordination through precisely aimed shots. His reputation for marksmanship made him one of Troy's most valuable tactical assets, as his ability to eliminate key personnel at crucial moments had repeatedly frustrated Greek offensive operations. Diomedes' approach to neutralizing this threat demonstrated the tactical intelligence that complemented his physical prowess. Rather than attempting a direct assault that would expose his forces to devastating archery fire, he used terrain features and coordinated movements to approach Pandarus from an unexpected angle. His advance took advantage of a shallow depression that provided concealment while allowing rapid movement toward the archer's position. The maneuver required precise timing and coordination, with supporting units that created diversionary attacks to mask his true objective. The confrontation between Diomedes and Pandarus exemplified the personal nature of Bronze Age warfare, where individual champions engaged in single combat that could determine the outcome of larger engagements. Pandarus attempted to use his bow's range advantage to eliminate the approaching Greek commander, but Diomedes' bronze-faced shield deflected the carefully aimed arrows while he closed the distance between them. The Lycian archer's final shot penetrated the outer layers of Diomedes' shield, but failed to achieve sufficient penetration to cause serious injury, leaving him vulnerable to close combat, where his opponent's superior training and equipment provided decisive advantages. Diomedes' spear thrust that ended Pandarus' life demonstrated the lethal efficiency of Greek military training and equipment. The bronze point, sharpened to razor keenness, and backed by the full force of a trained warrior's arm, penetrated the Lycian's leather corselet and drove deep into his chest cavity. The wound proved immediately fatal, as the spear point severed major blood vessels and damaged vital organs beyond any possibility of survival. Pandarus collapsed without delivering a final blow, his death eliminating one of Troy's most effective tactical specialists, while providing a significant morale boost for Greek forces. The psychological impact of Pandarus's death extended far beyond its immediate tactical consequences, as Trojan warriors recognized that one of their most reliable defensive assets had been eliminated by an enemy champion who appeared to be fighting with supernatural effectiveness. Diomedes' success against such a formidable opponent enhanced his reputation, while simultaneously demonstrating that Greek forces retained the capability for decisive action despite Achilles' withdrawal from combat. The victory provided tangible evidence that other heroes could achieve the extraordinary results when circumstances aligned properly. Athena's subtle enhancement of Diomedes' capabilities became more apparent as the battle progressed, and he encountered increasingly formidable opponents. The goddess of wisdom provided him with enhanced visual acuity that allowed him to distinguish between mortal enemies and the gods who occasionally intervened directly in combat, knowledge that proved crucial when he faced opponents who enjoyed divine protection. This supernatural assistance operated below the threshold of obvious intervention, while providing advantages that allowed purely human courage and skill to achieve results that might otherwise require divine power. The son of Tydeus demonstrated the extent of his enhanced abilities when he encountered Aeneas, the Trojan prince whose divine parentage through Aphrodite made him one of the war's most formidable champions. Aeneas commanded respect throughout both armies for his combination of royal authority, personal fighting prowess, and divine favour that had protected him during numerous previous engagements. His equipment included weapons and armour crafted by supernatural artisans, while his tactical training reflected both human military tradition and divine instruction that provided insights unavailable to purely mortal warriors. The confrontation between Diomedes and Aeneas represented a clash between different types of heroic excellence, as purely human achievement faced divinely enhanced capability in direct combat. Aeneas possessed advantages in equipment quality and supernatural protection that should have provided decisive superiority over any mortal opponent, but Diomedes' combination of enhanced perception and tactical skill allowed him to compete on roughly equal terms. The engagement demonstrated that exceptional human ability, when properly supported, could challenge even those who enjoyed direct divine favour. The battle's most extraordinary moment occurred when Aphrodite herself intervened to protect her son from Diomedes' increasingly effective attacks. The goddess of love materialized on the battlefield in her full divine splendor, her radiant beauty creating a supernatural presence that should have overwhelmed any mortal who dared to oppose her directly. Her intervention violated Zeus's prohibition against direct divine participation, but her maternal instincts overcame political calculations as she witnessed her beloved son facing mortal danger from an opponent whose effectiveness exceeded normal human limitations. Diomedes' response to Aphrodite's appearance demonstrated both the supernatural enhancement he had received from Athena and the extraordinary courage that characterized the greatest heroes of the Bronze Age. Rather than retreating in appropriate religious terror, he recognized the goddess's vulnerability in her current manifestation and pressed his attack with calculated precision. His bronze-tipped spear found its mark on Aphrodite's wrist, drawing golden ichor that flowed like liquid light from the divine wound while causing the goddess to cry out in pain and surprise. The wounding of Aphrodite represented an unprecedented breach of the normal boundaries between mortal and divine realms, as no human warrior had previously succeeded in inflicting physical injury on an Olympian deity. The goddess's immediate withdrawal from the battlefield, accompanied by agonized complaints about mortal presumption, created shockwaves throughout both armies as warriors witnessed their fundamental assumptions about divine invulnerability challenged by empirical evidence. The event established Diomedes as a figure of legendary status whose achievements transcended normal heroic categories. The political ramifications of this divine wounding extended far beyond its immediate battlefield impact, as other gods recognized that the established order governing relationships between mortal and immortal realms had been fundamentally challenged. Aphrodite's humiliation required response that would re-establish appropriate boundaries while punishing the presumption that had allowed a human warrior to injure an Olympian deity. However, the goddess's own violation of Zeus's prohibition complicated any potential retaliation, as she had created the circumstances that enabled Diomedes' extraordinary success through her unauthorized intervention. Diomedes' continued success throughout the day included additional encounters with the divine opponents that further established his reputation as a warrior capable of challenging supernatural authority. His confrontation with Ares, the god of war himself, represented the ultimate test of enhanced human capability against pure divine power. The god of war had entered the battle in support of Trojan forces, his presence on the battlefield creating terror among Greek ranks while inspiring corresponding confidence among their enemies. The battle between Diomedes and Ares demonstrated the complex relationship between divine power and mortal excellence that characterized heroic culture throughout the ancient world. Ares possessed overwhelming advantages in raw strength and supernatural capability, but his combat style emphasized brute force over tactical sophistication. Diomedes countered with superior technique and strategic thinking that allowed him to exploit weaknesses in the god's approach while maximizing his own enhanced abilities. The engagement revealed that divine power, when not properly applied, could be challenged by exceptional human skill supported by appropriate supernatural assistance. The outcome of this confrontation, Diomedes' successful wounding of Ares and the god's subsequent withdrawal from combat, established precedents that would influence divine behaviour throughout the remainder of the conflict. The gods learned that direct intervention carried risks that had not previously been apparent, while mortal heroes gained confidence that divine opponents were not invulnerable when faced with exceptional human capability. The psychological impact of these encounters shifted the balance of power between mortal and immortal realms in ways that would have lasting consequences for both sides. Paris's performance during this same period of intensified combat provided stark contrast to the heroic excellence displayed by champions like Diomedes. The Trojan prince, whose actions had initiated the entire conflict, demonstrated fighting abilities that fell far short of the standards expected from royal warriors, particularly those whose decisions had committed their people to devastating warfare. His reluctance to engage in personal combat created political problems within Troy's leadership while providing Greek propaganda with evidence of Trojan weakness and moral corruption. The most notorious example of Paris's military inadequacy occurred when he encountered Menelaus in single combat that should have provided an opportunity to resolve the fundamental dispute through personal confrontation between the principals involved. The challenge had been issued according to proper protocols, with both armies agreeing to honour the outcome as a definitive settlement of their differences. The stakes involved not merely personal honour, but the potential end of a conflict that had consumed thousands of lives and vast resources over nearly a decade of warfare. Paris's initial appearance for this crucial encounter demonstrated appropriate attention to ceremonial requirements, as he wore elaborate armour that reflected his royal status, while carrying weapons worthy of a Prince of Troy. His equipment included a bronze-headed spear crafted by master smiths, a sword with an ivory hilt decorated with gold inlay, and a shield that bore the royal insignia of Priam's house. His physical appearance suggested a warrior capable of meeting the challenge he had accepted, but his actual performance revealed fundamental deficiencies in both skill and courage. The confrontation began according to established protocols for formal single combat, with both warriors advancing to meet each other in the space between the opposing armies. Menelaus approached with the grim determination of a man seeking personal satisfaction for years of humiliation and loss, his equipment showing the practical simplicity favoured by experienced fighters over ceremonial display. His bronze-tipped spear had been tested in numerous previous engagements, while his shield bore the dents and scratches that marked genuine combat experience, rather than parade ground display. Paris's performance in the actual fighting demonstrated the gulf between royal pretension and warrior reality that characterised much of Bronze Age aristocratic culture. His spear cast, which should have been the opening move in a tactical sequence designed to disable his opponent, fell short of its target due to poor technique and inadequate training. His defensive work proved equally inadequate, as Menelaus' superior experience and motivation allowed him to dominate the engagement from its opening moments. The Spartan king's systematic dismantling of Paris' defences revealed both his own combat expertise and his opponent's fundamental inadequacy as a warrior. Menelaus' spearwork demonstrated the precision that came from years of training and battlefield experience, each thrust calculated to exploit weaknesses in Paris' defensive positioning. His shield manipulation showed equal mastery, as he used the bronze-faced circle not merely for protection but as an offensive weapon that created opportunities for decisive attacks. Paris' attempt to flee from combat when faced with inevitable defeat represented a violation of warrior honour codes that governed aristocratic behaviour throughout the ancient world. His retreat toward Trojan lines, abandoning weapons and dignity in favour of personal survival, created scandal that damaged Troy's political position while providing enemies with propaganda advantages. The sight of a royal prince fleeing from legitimate combat challenged fundamental assumptions about aristocratic courage and leadership that formed the basis of Bronze Age political authority. Aphrodite's intervention to rescue her favourite from the consequences of his cowardice created additional complications that extended beyond immediate military concerns. The goddess's supernatural removal of Paris from the battlefield violated both the formal terms of the single combat and Zeus's prohibition against direct divine intervention. Her action preserved her protégé's life while simultaneously undermining the legal and religious foundations that might have provided peaceful resolution of the conflict through trial by combat. The political ramifications of Paris' cowardice and supernatural rescue extended throughout Troy's leadership structure, creating divisions that would weaken the city's resistance during subsequent phases of the siege. Hector found himself in the impossible position of defending his brother's honour while privately recognising the damage that such behaviour caused to Trojan morale and international reputation. Other members of the royal family faced similar dilemmas as they attempted to balance family loyalty against political necessity and military effectiveness. The contrast between Paris' failure and the heroic achievements of warriors like Diomedes illustrated the spectrum of human capability that Bronze Age warfare revealed under extreme stress. While some individuals rose to legendary status through combinations of natural ability, training, and divine favour, others demonstrated the limitations that prevented ordinary mortals from achieving heroic excellence. These disparities in performance created the dramatic tensions that transformed military history into epic literature, while providing moral lessons about courage, honour, and the consequences of personal choices. The day's fighting established patterns of heroic behaviour and divine intervention that would characterise the war's remaining phases, as both sides recognised that individual excellence could achieve results that transcended normal military capabilities. The success of champions like Diomedes provided models for other warriors to emulate, while demonstrating that appropriate divine support could enable mortal heroes to challenge even supernatural opponents. These precedents would influence tactical planning and strategic thinking throughout the remainder of the conflict, as commanders sought to create conditions where their best warriors could achieve similar moments of transcendent glory. The divine deception that had temporarily neutralized Zeus's oversight created an opening that Trojan forces exploited with devastating effectiveness under Hector's masterful leadership. The elder son of Priam had spent years studying Greek tactical methods, observing their formations and identifying weaknesses that could be exploited when circumstances permitted aggressive action. His strategic brilliance manifested in a coordinated assault that combined traditional Trojan strengths in chariot warfare with innovative infantry tactics designed specifically to counter Greek defensive advantages. The attack began before dawn, when Trojan scouts reported the unusual positioning of Greek sentries and the apparent confusion in their command structure following the previous day's divine interventions. Hector's battle plan demonstrated the sophisticated military thinking that had made him Troy's most effective commander throughout 9 years of siege warfare. Rather than attempting frontal assaults against prepared Greek positions, He organised a series of coordinated attacks that struck multiple points simultaneously, preventing enemy commanders from concentrating their forces effectively. Trojan chariots swept around the flanks of Greek defensive lines, while infantry units advanced through carefully selected approach routes that maximised cover and minimised exposure to enemy archery fire. The timing of these movements required precise coordination that reflected years of training and the intimate knowledge of local terrain that gave Trojan forces significant tactical advantages. The psychological impact of this renewed Trojan aggression immediately became apparent as Greek warriors recognised that their enemies possessed capabilities they had not previously displayed. Units that had grown accustomed to defensive warfare found themselves facing coordinated attacks that exploited weaknesses in their positioning and tactical doctrine. The absence of Achilles and his Myrmidons created gaps in Greek battle lines that Hector's forces identified and exploited with surgical precision, demonstrating that Trojan military leadership had learned valuable lessons from years of observing enemy operations. Greek resistance initially centred around the natural leaders who had emerged during Achilles' withdrawal from combat. Agamemnon himself took the field wearing the magnificent armour that marked his status as supreme commander. The bronze plates of his corselet decorated with gold inlay that caught the morning sunlight in brilliant displays of reflected glory. His helmet bore a horsehair plume dyed crimson that identified him to both friend and foe across the battlefield, while his shield displayed the royal insignia of Mycenae, worked in precious metals by master craftsmen. His presence in the front ranks provided crucial morale benefits for Greek forces while demonstrating his personal commitment to the coalition's military objectives. The king of Mycenae fought with the skill expected from a warrior who had achieved supreme command through both political manoeuvring and demonstrated martial prowess. His spearwork showed the precision that came from decades of training in palace courtyards and on battlefields throughout the Greek world, each thrust calculated to exploit gaps in enemy armour or defensive positioning. His bronze-tipped weapon found its mark repeatedly as Trojan warriors discovered that their supreme enemy possessed fighting abilities that matched his political authority. The sight of Agamemnon personally engaging enemy champions provided inspiration for Greek units that had begun to waver under Trojan pressure. However, the intensity of combat that characterised this renewed phase of warfare created casualty rates that neither side could sustain indefinitely. Agamemnon's aggressive leadership style, while effective for maintaining morale, exposed him to personal risks that proved costly when a Trojan spear found a gap in his armour's protection. The bronze point penetrated the layered linen corselet that protected his torso, creating a wound that, while not immediately fatal, forced his withdrawal from active combat at a crucial moment when Greek forces needed visible leadership to maintain their cohesion against mounting Trojan pressure. The loss of their supreme commander's direct battlefield presence created immediate tactical problems for Greek forces already struggling to maintain defensive positions against coordinated enemy attacks. Unit commanders found themselves operating without the central coordination that Agamemnon's personal leadership had provided, forcing them to make independent decisions about tactical priorities and resource allocation. This fragmentation of command authority played directly into Hector's strategic planning, as Trojan forces had been specifically trained to exploit exactly these types of coordination failures in enemy operations. Odysseus emerged as a natural replacement for Agamemnon's battlefield leadership, his reputation for tactical intelligence and personal courage making him an obvious choice for coordinating Greek resistance. The king of Ithaca possessed extensive experience in siege warfare and amphibious operations that provided valuable expertise for the defensive fighting that circumstances now required. His equipment reflected practical considerations rather than ceremonial display, with weapons and armour chosen for effectiveness rather than impressive appearance. His bronze-tipped spear had been tested in numerous previous engagements, while his shield bore the practical modifications that experienced warriors made to improve battlefield performance. Odysseus demonstrated his tactical acumen by organising a fighting withdrawal that preserved Greek forces while denying Trojans the decisive victory they sought. His defensive positions took advantage of natural terrain features that channeled enemy attacks into predetermined killing zones, where Greek advantages in heavy infantry fighting could be maximised. The withdrawal proceeded in carefully coordinated stages that maintained unit cohesion, while preventing Trojan forces from achieving the breakthrough that might have collapsed Greek resistance entirely. His personal example of controlled aggression, under pressure, provided the leadership that individual unit commanders needed to maintain discipline during extremely difficult tactical circumstances. The son of Laertes achieved several notable individual successes during this fighting, his spear accounting for multiple Trojan casualties, including several enemy champions, whose deaths provided significant morale benefits for hard-pressed Greek forces. His combat technique demonstrated the sophisticated training that characterized elite Greek warriors, with spear work that showed precision developed through years of practice and shield manipulation that used the bronze-faced circle as both defensive tool and offensive weapon. His tactical awareness allowed him to identify and exploit weaknesses in enemy formations, while avoiding the isolated combat that might have resulted in his capture or death. However, even Odysseus's exceptional capabilities proved insufficient to prevent the gradual erosion of Greek defensive positions under sustained Trojan pressure. An enemy spear thrust that penetrated his thigh created a wound that, while not life-threatening, significantly reduced his mobility and combat effectiveness, at precisely the moment when Greek resistance needed maximum leadership capability. His forced withdrawal from the front lines removed another crucial element of Greek tactical coordination, leaving their forces increasingly fragmented and vulnerable to the coordinated attacks that Hector continued to orchestrate with devastating precision. Diomedes of Argos assumed battlefield leadership responsibilities that his previous day's heroic performance had established him to handle, but the son of Tydeus soon discovered that individual prowess, however exceptional, could not compensate for the systematic tactical advantages that Trojan forces had achieved through superior coordination and strategic planning. His natural fighting abilities remained formidable, enhanced by the divine favour that Athena continued to provide within the constraints imposed by Zeus's prohibition against direct intervention. His bronze-tipped spear continued to find its mark with lethal precision, while his shield work demonstrated the mastery that had allowed him to wound divine opponents during previous engagements. The Argive champion's tactical intelligence became apparent in his efforts to reorganize Greek defensive positions to better resist Trojan attacks that exploited weaknesses in their formation and positioning. He identified key terrain features that could anchor defensive lines, while providing overlapping fields of fire that maximized Greek advantages in archery and spear work. His personal example of aggressive defense inspired individual warriors, while his tactical innovations provided unit commanders with specific guidance for improving their battlefield performance under extremely challenging circumstances. Nevertheless, the cumulative pressure of sustained Trojan attacks eventually overwhelmed even Diomedes' exceptional capabilities. A coordinated assault by multiple enemy champions created tactical situations that exceeded any individual warrior's ability to control, regardless of personal skill or divine enhancement. The bronze point of a Trojan spear found its mark in his foot, creating an injury that severely limited his mobility while forcing his withdrawal from the active fighting that his leadership had been coordinating. His removal from battlefield command eliminated the last major source of tactical coordination that had been maintaining Greek resistance against increasingly effective Trojan pressure. The systematic elimination of Greek battlefield leadership created exactly the conditions that Hector had anticipated when planning his coordinated offensive operations. With Agamemnon, Odysseus and Diomedes all removed from active combat through wounds that prevented their continued participation, Greek forces found themselves operating without the central coordination that effective defensive warfare required. Individual units fought with characteristic courage and skill, but their efforts lacked the strategic coherence that could have prevented Trojan forces from achieving the breakthrough that their superior planning and execution had made increasingly inevitable. The psychological impact of losing their primary battlefield leaders proved even more devastating than the immediate tactical consequences of their absence. Greek warriors recognized that their most capable commanders had been systematically eliminated through enemy action that demonstrated superior strategic thinking and tactical execution. The realization that Trojan forces possessed military capabilities that exceeded previous estimates created morale problems that threatened to collapse Greek resistance entirely, as individual soldiers began questioning whether continued fighting could achieve anything beyond prolonging their inevitable defeat. The Greek retreat toward their fortified camp accelerated as Trojan pressure intensified, and coordination between different units continued to deteriorate. What had begun as an organised withdrawal under competent leadership devolved into something approaching a rout as individual contingents made independent decisions about tactical priorities without reference to overall strategic objectives. The sight of Greek forces in apparent flight provided enormous morale benefits for Trojan attackers, while simultaneously demonstrating to neutral observers that the balance of military capability had shifted dramatically in favour of the defenders. Hector's pursuit of retreating Greek forces demonstrated both tactical restraint and strategic vision that distinguished superior military leadership from mere battlefield prowess. Rather than allowing his troops to become scattered in pursuit of individual enemies, he maintained formation integrity that preserved Trojan advantages while preventing the kind of tactical reversal that disciplined defenders might achieve against overextended attackers. His advance proceeded in carefully coordinated stages that maintained pressure on Greek forces while avoiding the risks inherent in uncontrolled pursuit operations. The Trojan prince's strategic objective extended beyond immediate tactical success to encompass the complete destruction of Greek military capability through the capture or destruction of their fortified camp and naval base. He recognised that eliminating the infrastructure that supported Greek siege operations would achieve decisive strategic results that mere battlefield victories could not provide. His tactical planning therefore emphasised objectives that would force Greek forces into defensive positions where their numerical and logistical disadvantages could be exploited to maximum effect. The Greek fortifications that had protected their camp and ships for 9 years suddenly became their last line of defence against Trojan forces whose military capabilities had been systematically underestimated. The massive earthworks and wooden palisades that surrounded the beach fleet represented enormous investments of labour and engineering expertise that reflected the sophisticated organisational capabilities of Bronze Age armies. These defensive works included multiple defensive lines, strategically positioned gates that controlled access to critical areas, and watchtowers that provided observation of both land and sea approaches to the Greek position. However, the fortifications had been designed primarily to protect against raids and limited attacks rather than the sustained assault by organised Trojan forces that Hector's strategic planning now made possible. The defensive works lacked the depth and complexity that would be required to resist determined attacks by enemies who possessed detailed knowledge of their construction and tactical vulnerabilities. Greek engineers had focused on creating barriers that would deter casual attacks rather than fortifications capable of withstanding systematic siege operations by competent military forces. The construction of these defensive works had required enormous efforts that demonstrated both the organisational capabilities and the strategic foresight of Greek military leadership during the siege's early phases. Thousands of workers had laboured for months to create earthworks that extended for nearly 2 miles along the coastline, moving massive quantities of soil and stone to create barriers that rose to heights of 15 feet or more. The wooden palisades that topped these earthworks had been constructed from timber cut in the forests of Mount Ida, transported to the construction sites through supply operations that required careful coordination and substantial logistical support. The symbolic significance of these fortifications extended far beyond their immediate military utility, as they represented the transformation of Greek forces from confident invaders to desperate defenders whose survival depended on artificial barriers rather than superior military capability. The psychological impact of this defensive mindset had been growing throughout the siege's later years, as warriors who had expected quick victory found themselves trapped behind walls that symbolized their inability to achieve their original objectives through offensive action. The fortifications thus became monuments to Greek failure as much as protection against enemy attack. The strategic implications of Greek retreat behind their fortifications created exactly the tactical situation that Trojan forces had been seeking throughout 9 years of siege warfare. Instead of being forced to defend fixed positions against mobile Greek attacks, Trojan forces could now concentrate their efforts against defensive works whose locations and capabilities were well known to their engineers and tactical planners. The role reversal that placed Greeks in defensive positions while allowing Trojans tactical initiative represented a fundamental shift in strategic balance that reflected the superior military leadership that Hector had demonstrated throughout the campaign. The night raid that Hector organised to gather intelligence about Greek defensive preparations demonstrated the sophisticated approach to military operations that characterised his leadership style. Rather than relying on direct assault against prepared positions, he sought detailed information about enemy capabilities and intentions that would allow Trojan forces to exploit specific weaknesses in Greek defensive planning. The mission required careful selection of personnel whose skills in reconnaissance and infiltration could provide crucial tactical intelligence without alerting Greek forces to Trojan intentions. Dolon, a Trojan warrior whose family background in trade and diplomacy had provided him with valuable skills in languages and cultural practices, volunteered for this dangerous mission in exchange for promises of substantial rewards that included Achilles' famous horses. His knowledge of Greek customs and military practices made him an ideal choice for infiltration operations that required understanding of enemy procedures and recognition signals. His equipment included clothing and weapons that would allow him to pass for a Greek warrior if detected during his approach to enemy positions, while his knowledge of local terrain provided alternative escape routes if the mission encountered unexpected difficulties. The intelligence objectives that Dolon's mission was designed to achieve reflected Hector's systematic approach to military planning and his recognition that detailed information about enemy capabilities was essential for successful offensive operations. The raid aimed to determine the exact locations of Greek defensive positions, identify the strength and disposition of guard units, and assess the morale and combat readiness of forces that had been retreating under Trojan pressure. This information would allow Trojan commanders to plan attacks that exploited specific weaknesses while avoiding areas where Greek defences remained strong. Dolon's capture by Odysseus and Diomedes during their own reconnaissance mission created a complex intelligence situation where both sides sought information about enemy intentions while protecting their own operational security. The two Greek heroes had undertaken their night operation partly to gather intelligence about Trojan plans and partly to restore their reputations through bold action that demonstrated continued Greek capability for offensive operations. Their encounter with the Trojan spy provided unexpected opportunities for gaining crucial information while eliminating a threat to their own defensive preparations. The interrogation techniques that Odysseus employed demonstrated both the sophisticated approach to intelligence warfare that characterized Bronze Age military operations and the psychological methods that experienced commanders used to extract information from captured enemies. Rather than relying solely on physical coercion, the king of Ithaca combined threats with promises and psychological manipulation designed to convince Dolon that cooperation offered his best chance for survival. The approach reflected understanding that reliable intelligence required techniques that motivated truthful disclosure, rather than desperate fabrication designed to end immediate suffering. The information that Dolon provided under interrogation revealed crucial details about Trojan tactical planning and the disposition of Allied forces that supported their offensive operations. His disclosure of the location and strength of Thracian cavalry units that had recently arrived to reinforce Trojan forces provided Odysseus and Diomedes with opportunities for tactical operations that could significantly impact the strategic balance between the opposing armies. The intelligence also revealed weaknesses in Trojan security arrangements that could be exploited through carefully planned raids against specific high-value targets. The countermission that Odysseus and Diomedes organised based on this intelligence demonstrated the sophisticated approach to special operations that characterised elite Greek military units. Their attack on the Thracian encampment combined detailed tactical planning with the individual combat skills that had made both warriors legendary throughout the Greek world. The operation required precise timing and coordination that would allow them to achieve maximum impact while avoiding the superior numbers that would make prolonged combat impossible to survive. The successful night raid against Rhesus had provided only temporary respite from the mounting crisis that threatened to destroy the Greek expedition entirely. While Odysseus and Diomedes had demonstrated that individual Greek warriors retained their legendary capabilities, the strategic situation continued to deteriorate as Trojan forces under Hector's masterful leadership pressed their systematic assault against the fortified camp. The earthworks and wooden palisades that had protected the beached ships for 9 years now represented the last barrier between the coalition forces and complete annihilation. Their defensive value diminished by the absence of the tactical coordination that effective resistance required. The psychological pressure created by this desperate situation weighed most heavily on Achilles, whose withdrawal from combat had been intended as a temporary demonstration of his indispensable value to the coalition rather than a permanent abandonment of the Greek cause. From his position at the edge of the camp, the son of Peleus could observe the systematic destruction of forces that had once seemed invincible, watching as Trojan spears claimed warriors he'd fought alongside for nearly a decade. The sight of Greek blood flowing freely while his own myrmidons remained inactive behind their ships created internal tensions that challenged his resolve to maintain the principled stand that had defined his response to Agamemnon's insult. Patroclus, the beloved companion who had shared Achilles' exile from his homeland and followed him to Troy despite having no direct obligation to participate in Menelaus's war, observed his friend's growing anguish with the intimate understanding that came from years of close association. The son of Menelaus possessed insights into Achilles' character that extended beyond the public persona of the invincible warrior to encompass the complex emotional landscape that drove his decisions and shaped his responses to the moral dilemmas that warfare inevitably created. His role as confidant and advisor had evolved throughout their relationship into something approaching that of a conscience that could challenge Achilles' judgments without threatening their fundamental bond. The friendship between Achilles and Patroclus represented one of the most profound relationships in ancient literature, transcending simple military alliance to embody the ideals of loyalty, mutual support, and shared destiny that defined aristocratic warrior culture at its highest levels. Their bond had been forged during childhood in the palace of Peleus, where Patroclus had arrived as a refugee following his accidental killing of a playmate during a dice game. The young exile had found protection and purpose in service to Achilles, whose exceptional abilities and divine parentage marked him for extraordinary destiny from birth. Their relationship combined elements of brotherhood, friendship, and mutual dependence that create emotional ties stronger than those binding most blood relatives. Patroclus possessed qualities that complemented Achilles' more dramatic characteristics, while providing balance that moderated his friend's tendency toward extreme responses to perceived injustices. Where Achilles embodied the fierce pride and uncompromising honour that defined heroic excellence, Patroclus demonstrated compassion and practical wisdom that recognised the human costs of absolute positions. His gentle nature and diplomatic skills had repeatedly helped resolve conflicts that Achilles' more aggressive approach might have escalated into permanent divisions, making him invaluable as both personal advisor and political intermediary within the complex relationships that governed coalition politics. The sight of Greek forces retreating in apparent disorder, while Trojan spears claimed increasing numbers of casualties, created pressures that tested Patroclus' ability to maintain his friend's resolve to continue the boycott that had already achieved its intended demonstration of his military value. The sounds of battle carried clearly across the camp. The clash of bronze weapons, the screams of wounded men, the shouted orders of commanders attempting to maintain unit cohesion under impossible circumstances. These auditory reminders of the suffering that continued while the coalition's greatest warrior remained inactive created moral dilemmas that challenged the principles underlying Achilles' withdrawal from combat. Patroclus approached his friend during the afternoon hours when the intensity of Trojan attacks had forced Greek defenders back to their final defensive positions around the beach ships themselves. The son of Menoetius wore the simple tunic and cloak appropriate to his status as a warrior's companion, his appearance reflecting practical considerations rather than the elaborate display that characterized formal military occasions. His expression combined genuine concern for the coalition's desperate situation with understanding of the personal conflicts that prevented Achilles from responding to appeals for assistance that had been arriving throughout the day from various Greek commanders. The appeal that Patroclus delivered represented a carefully crafted argument that acknowledged the legitimacy of Achilles' grievances while emphasizing the moral obligations that transcended personal honor in situations where innocent lives faced immediate destruction. He reminded his friend of the bonds of loyalty and mutual obligation that connected them to warriors who had shared the dangers and hardships of 9 years of siege warfare, men whose deaths would serve no useful purpose beyond satisfying Trojan revenge for previous Greek successes. His words emphasized that true honor required consideration of consequences that extended beyond personal satisfaction to encompass the welfare of those who depended on superior strength and skill for their survival. The son of Menoetius presented his request with a diplomatic skill that had made him valuable as an intermediary in previous conflicts, framing his appeal in terms that respected Achilles' legitimate anger while providing alternative approaches that could satisfy honor without requiring complete abandonment of principle. He suggested that Achilles' personal participation in combat might be unnecessary if other means could be found to provide Greek forces with the tactical advantages they needed to resist Trojan pressure effectively. His proposal that he himself might lead the Myrmidons into battle while wearing Achilles' distinctive armour offered a compromise that could achieve immediate military objectives without forcing his friend to abandon the position that had defined his response to Agamemnon's insult. This suggestion demonstrated Patroclus' sophisticated understanding of both military psychology and the practical considerations that governed battlefield effectiveness in Bronze Age warfare. The sight of Achilles' unmistakable armour and the presence of his legendary Myrmidons would provide enormous morale benefits for hard-pressed Greek forces while simultaneously creating confusion among Trojan attackers who might mistake Patroclus for the warrior they most feared to encounter. The deception would not need to survive extended scrutiny, as even temporary tactical advantages might be sufficient to break the momentum of Trojan attacks and allow Greek forces to re-establish defensive positions that could resist further assault. Achilles' response to this proposal revealed the depth of internal conflict that had been building throughout the day as he witnessed the systematic destruction of forces that had once seemed invincible. His natural instincts as a warrior demanded immediate action to protect allies who faced annihilation, but his commitment to the principles that had justified his withdrawal created obligations that prevented direct participation in combat that might be interpreted as capitulation to Agamemnon's arbitrary authority. The compromise that Patroclus suggested offered resolution of these competing demands while preserving the essential elements of his position regarding proper recognition and respect for individual honour. The decision to allow Patroclus to lead the Myrmidons while wearing his armour represented both practical military necessity and profound personal trust that reflected the depth of their relationship. Achilles' equipment included weapons and defensive gear crafted by divine artisans whose supernatural skills had created items that exceeded normal human capabilities in both protective value and symbolic significance. The bronze plates of his corselet had been forged by Hephaestus himself, according to specifications provided by Thetis, while his helmet bore decorative elements that marked it as the property of a hero destined for legendary status. His shield displayed artistic work that represented the entire cosmos in miniature, its surface decorated with scenes that encompassed all aspects of human civilization and natural phenomena. The ritual of transferring this equipment to Patroclus carried symbolic weight that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations, as it represented a temporary delegation of heroic identity that would allow the son of Menoetius to embody the martial excellence that Achilles' name represented throughout both armies. The bronze corselet that had protected its owner through countless engagements would now shield a different warrior whose courage and loyalty had earned the right to wear it in service of their shared values and mutual obligations. The helmet, whose horsehair plume had become synonymous with invincible prowess, would now identify Patroclus as the temporary bearer of that legendary reputation. The psychological transformation that occurred as Patroclus donned this legendary equipment became apparent immediately to the Myrmidons who would follow him into battle. Warriors who had served under Achilles' command for nearly a decade recognized the significance of their leader's decision to entrust his most precious possessions to his beloved companion, understanding that this gesture represented both supreme confidence in Patroclus's abilities and acknowledgement that circumstances demanded extraordinary measures. Their response combined excitement at the prospect of returning to active combat with determination to prove worthy of the trust that had been placed in their unit's capabilities. The Myrmidons themselves represented the elite of Greek military forces, warriors selected for exceptional skill and trained to standards that exceeded those maintained by other coalition contingents. Their equipment reflected both superior craftsmanship and the wealth that Achilles' royal status had made available for outfitting his personal forces. Bronze spear points had been sharpened to razor keenness and balanced for optimal throwing characteristics, while layered linen corselets provided protection that combined flexibility with defensive effectiveness. Their shields bore the distinctive markings that identified them as members of an elite unit, while their disciplined formations demonstrated the training that had made them legendary throughout the Greek world. The tactical briefing that Achilles provided before Patroclus led the Myrmidons into combat revealed both his continued engagement with military developments and his sophisticated understanding of the strategic situation that confronted Greek forces. His instructions emphasized specific objectives that would maximize the psychological impact of Myrmidon intervention while avoiding the extended engagement that might expose Patroclus to unnecessary risks. The mission focused on breaking Trojan momentum through decisive action at crucial points, rather than attempting to achieve complete tactical victory that would require capabilities beyond those available to any single unit. Achilles' warning that Patroclus should limit his objectives to driving Trojan forces away from the ships, rather than pursuing them toward the city walls, reflected both tactical wisdom and personal concern for his friend's safety. The son of Peleus understood that extended pursuit operations would separate the Myrmidons from supporting Greek forces while exposing them to counterattacks by fresh Trojan reserves that had not yet been committed to the assault on the fortified camp. His instructions emphasized the importance of achieving immediate tactical objectives without becoming overextended in ways that might transform successful intervention into catastrophic defeat. The appearance of Patroclus leading the Myrmidons onto the battlefield created immediate confusion among both Greek and Trojan forces, as warriors attempted to identify the figure whose distinctive armour suggested the return of their most feared or celebrated opponent. Greek defenders who had been retreating under Trojan pressure suddenly found their morale restored by what appeared to be Achilles' decision to abandon his withdrawal and resume active participation in the coalition's military operations. The sight of the legendary corselet and helmet advancing at the head of the elite Myrmidon phalanx provided inspiration that translated into renewed resistance and tactical coordination that had been lacking throughout the day's fighting. Trojan forces experienced corresponding psychological shock as they recognized the apparent presence of the warrior whose absence had made their recent successes possible. Individual champions who had been pressing attacks with confidence born of Greek disorganization suddenly found themselves facing an opponent whose reputation for invincible prowess had been established through years of devastating effectiveness against their finest warriors. The confusion created by Patroclus' appearance in Achilles' armour disrupted Trojan tactical coordination while providing Greek forces with crucial breathing space that allowed them to re-establish defensive positions around their threatened ships. The initial success of Patroclus' intervention exceeded even Achilles' optimistic expectations, as the Myrmidons demonstrated the tactical superiority that had made them legendary throughout the ancient world. Their coordinated spearwork created overlapping fields of bronze points that channeled Trojan attacks into predetermined killing zones where defensive advantages could be maximised. The unit's disciplined advance proceeded in carefully controlled stages that maintained formation integrity while preventing the kind of tactical reversal that scattered forces might suffer when faced with coordinated counterattacks by competent enemies. Patroclus himself fought with inspiration that reflected both his natural courage and the psychological enhancement that came from wearing equipment that symbolised heroic excellence. His spearwork demonstrated precision that had been developed through years of training alongside Achilles, each thrust calculated to exploit gaps in enemy armour or defensive positioning. His shield manipulation showed mastery of techniques that used the bronze-faced circle as both protective tool and offensive weapon, creating opportunities for decisive attacks while maintaining the defensive posture that his tactical situation required. The son of Menoetius achieved several notable individual successes during the early phases of this engagement, his bronze-tipped spear accounting for multiple Trojan casualties, including enemy champions, whose deaths provided significant morale benefits for Greek forces throughout the battlefield. His combat technique combined the aggressive spirit that characterized elite Greek warriors with the tactical restraint that recognized the importance of maintaining unit cohesion under combat conditions. His personal example of controlled aggression provided the leadership that individual Myrmidons needed to maintain discipline while achieving the tactical objectives that their mission required. The systematic destruction of Trojan assault formations under Myrmidon pressure created opportunities for other Greek units to resume offensive operations that had been impossible while they remained trapped in purely defensive positions. Contingents that had been forced back to their ships suddenly found themselves able to advance and reclaim ground that had been lost during the morning's fighting. The restoration of tactical initiative allowed Greek commanders to coordinate counterattacks that exploited the confusion created by Patroclus' intervention while preventing Trojan forces from regrouping effectively. However, the very success of this intervention created new dangers that reflected the psychological transformation that combat achievement could produce in even the most disciplined warriors. Patroclus found himself intoxicated by the combination of tactical success and the adulation that his apparent identity as Achilles generated among both friend and foe. The experience of wielding legendary equipment while leading elite forces to victory against previously successful enemies created emotional pressures that challenged his ability to maintain the tactical restraint that his mission required. The pursuit of retreating Trojan forces that Patroclus organised despite Achilles' explicit warnings about the dangers of overextension demonstrated how combat success could corrupt judgment and lead to tactical decisions that violated strategic wisdom. The sight of enemy warriors fleeing in apparent disorder created opportunities that seemed too valuable to ignore, particularly when the psychological momentum generated by Myrmidon intervention appeared capable of achieving decisive results that might end Trojan resistance entirely. The temptation to transform tactical success into strategic victory proved too powerful to resist despite the risks that extended operations would create. The advance toward Troy's walls that resulted from this decision placed the Myrmidons in increasingly dangerous tactical positions as they moved beyond the supporting range of other Greek forces while approaching areas where Trojan defensive advantages could be maximised. The rough terrain that surrounded the city channeled attacking forces into approaches that could be covered by archery fire from the massive walls, while the distance from Greek base positions made retreat increasingly difficult if Trojan reserves succeeded in organising effective counterattacks. The tactical situation that Patroclus created through his pursuit violated fundamental principles of military operations that emphasized maintaining secure lines of communication and retreat. The intervention of Apollo that marked the beginning of Patroclus's doom reflected the divine politics that continued to influence mortal affairs despite Zeus's prohibition against direct interference. The god of prophecy and plague had maintained consistent support for Trojan forces throughout the conflict, providing protection for key defenders while inspiring resistance that prevented Greek forces from achieving decisive victories. His decision to intervene personally against Patroclus represented both response to Trojan prayers for divine assistance and recognition that the current tactical situation threatened to upset the broader strategic balance that divine politics required. Apollo's initial assault on Patroclus took the form of supernatural disorientation that clouded the warrior's judgment, while reducing his combat effectiveness at the crucial moment when clear thinking was most essential for survival. The god's invisible presence on the battlefield created psychological pressures that affected Patroclus's ability to assess tactical situations accurately while making decisions that reflected his actual capabilities rather than the inflated confidence that recent success had generated. This divine intervention operated below the threshold of conscious awareness, while producing effects that would prove fatal when combined with the physical dangers that extended combat operations inevitably created. The climactic encounter between Patroclus and Hector occurred in the shadow of Troy's walls, where the tactical advantages that had favoured Greek forces during the earlier phases of fighting no longer applied. The Trojan prince had rallied his scattered forces through personal leadership that demonstrated why he had maintained his reputation as Troy's most effective military commander throughout 9 years of siege warfare. His tactical position near the city's defences provided access to fresh reserves while offering secure retreat routes if the engagement developed unfavourably, advantages that Patroclus's extended advance had forfeited through distance from supporting Greek forces. Hector's recognition that his opponent was not actually Achilles came through careful observation of fighting techniques and tactical approaches that differed subtly but significantly from those employed by the legendary warrior whose identity Patroclus had assumed. The eldest son of Priam possessed intimate knowledge of Achilles' combat style, gained through years of battlefield encounters and tactical analysis, understanding that allowed him to distinguish between authentic and imitated techniques, despite the identical equipment that created visual similarity. This recognition provided crucial psychological advantages that restored Hector's confidence while revealing tactical opportunities that could be exploited against an opponent whose capabilities, however formidable, fell short of legendary standards. The bronze spear thrust that ended Patroclus's life demonstrated both Hector's exceptional skill as a warrior and the role that divine intervention played in determining the outcome of combat between elite opponents. Apollo's supernatural assistance had created the opening that allowed Hector's weapon to find its mark, penetrating the legendary corselet that should have provided adequate protection against mortal weapons. The bronze point drove deep into Patroclus's torso, severing major blood vessels and damaging vital organs in ways that made survival impossible despite the immediate medical attention that his status as a hero would normally have guaranteed. The stripping of Achilles' armour from Patroclus's corpse represented both a practical seizure of valuable equipment and a symbolic victory that carried implications extending far beyond immediate tactical considerations. Hector's possession of the legendary corselet and helmet transformed him into a figure whose appearance would create psychological effects similar to those that Patroclus had achieved through his impersonation of Achilles. The equipment's transfer also represented a profound insult to Achilles himself, as it demonstrated Trojan ability to defeat and humiliate the warrior, whose withdrawal had been intended to demonstrate his indispensable value to the Greek cause. The news of Patroclus's death reached Achilles through Antilochus, the son of Nestor who had witnessed the final stages of the battle and recognized the strategic implications of what had occurred. The young warrior's approach to Achilles' position demonstrated the careful protocol required when delivering catastrophic news to figures whose emotional responses might have dangerous consequences for everyone in their vicinity. His words combined respectful acknowledgement of the loss with practical information about the tactical situation that Patroclus' death had created, emphasizing both personal tragedy and military necessity in ways that recognized Achilles' dual roles as grieving friend and potential military leader. The transformation that occurred in Achilles upon learning of his beloved companion's death transcended normal human responses to personal loss, encompassing psychological changes that redefined his fundamental relationship with life, death, and the pursuit of glory that had previously motivated his actions. The grief that overwhelmed him combined elements of personal devastation with rage that demanded satisfaction through violence that would exceed anything he'd previously contemplated. His immediate response involved physical manifestations of mourning that included tearing his clothing, covering himself with dust and ashes, and crying out with such intensity that his divine mother heard his anguish from her underwater palace. The psychological mechanism that transformed Achilles from withdrawn observer to vengeful fury reflected the complex relationship between love and violence that characterized aristocratic warrior culture throughout the ancient world. His previous withdrawal from combat had been motivated by principles of honor and justice that recognized limits to acceptable behavior, but Patroclus' death eliminated these moral constraints by creating obligations that transcended normal ethical considerations. The son of Peleus now faced choices between accepting permanent loss of the person he valued most in the world, or pursuing revenge that would require abandoning the very principles that had defined his previous actions. Thetis's immediate appearance in response to her son's grief demonstrated both her supernatural awareness of mortal events and her understanding that this crisis would require divine intervention to prevent consequences that might extend beyond individual tragedy to encompass cosmic disruption. The sea goddess recognized that Achilles' current emotional state made him capable of actions that could challenge fundamental boundaries between mortal and divine realms, potentially creating conflicts that would require resolution through methods that might threaten the stability of the entire cosmic order. Her presence provided both maternal comfort and divine guidance that could channel his rage toward objectives that served broader purposes than simple revenge. The promise of new armour crafted by Hephaestus himself represented both practical necessity and symbolic transformation that would mark Achilles' return to combat as qualitatively different from his previous military activities. The divine smith's supernatural craftsmanship would create equipment that exceeded normal human capabilities, while providing protection adequate for the unprecedented challenges that lay ahead. The new corselet, helmet, and shield would embody divine favour while serving as tangible reminders of the cosmic forces that supported his quest for vengeance against those responsible for Patroclus' death. The psychological preparation that Achilles underwent during the hours following Patroclus' death involved fundamental changes in his relationship with mortality and the pursuit of glory that had previously defined heroic excellence. His acceptance of prophetic knowledge that participation in Hector's destruction would inevitably lead to his own death represented abandonment of the survival instincts that normally governed human behaviour in favour of values that prioritised revenge over personal preservation. This transformation created a figure whose motivations transcended normal human limitations, while embodying the terrible power that absolute commitment to vengeance could generate when supported by divine favour and superhuman capability. The divine armour that Hephaestus forged during the night following Patroclus' death represented more than replacement equipment for a grieving warrior. It embodied the cosmic forces that would transform Achilles from mortal hero into an instrument of divine vengeance. The lame god of the forge worked with supernatural intensity in his bronze-walled workshop beneath Mount Olympus, his massive bellows creating temperatures that exceeded anything achievable through mortal craftsmanship. The rhythmic hammering of his divine tools against celestial bronze created reverberations that echoed through the foundations of the world, each strike binding supernatural properties into metal that would protect and enhance its wearer, beyond normal human limitations. The corselet that emerged from this divine craftsmanship combined protective capabilities with artistic excellence that reflected Hephaestus's dual nature as both supreme craftsman and creative artist. The bronze plates had been shaped with precision that allowed perfect freedom of movement while providing comprehensive protection against weapons that might penetrate ordinary armour. The surface decoration incorporated gold and silver inlay work that depicted scenes of cosmic significance, transforming functional military equipment into a masterpiece that proclaimed its wearer's connection to divine power. The corselet's weight distribution had been calculated to enhance rather than impede the natural movements of an elite warrior, while its bronze surface had been polished to mirror brightness that would reflect sunlight in displays of supernatural radiance. The helmet that accompanied this divine corselet exceeded even the legendary headpiece that Hector had claimed from Patroclus's corpse, its bronze construction reinforced with silver bands that provided additional structural strength while creating decorative patterns of extraordinary beauty. The horsehair plume that crowned this masterpiece had been dyed with colours that seemed to shift and change according to lighting conditions, creating visual effects that suggested supernatural properties beyond mere artistic achievement. The helmet's face guard had been crafted to allow unrestricted vision and breathing, while protecting vulnerable areas that enemy weapons might target during close combat. The interior padding incorporated materials that provided comfort during extended wear, while absorbing the shock of impacts that might otherwise cause concussion or disorientation. The shield that Hephaestus created as the centerpiece of this divine panoply represented the most complex artistic and technical achievement in the history of supernatural craftsmanship. Its circular surface, measuring nearly 4 feet in diameter, had been constructed from multiple layers of bronze, gold, silver and tin that created both structural strength and the foundation for decorative work that encompassed the entire cosmos in miniature. The shield's rim bore geometric patterns that suggested the mathematical principles underlying natural phenomena, while its central boss displayed the Earth surrounded by the ocean that ancient geography recognized as the boundary of the inhabited world. The shield's artistic program reflected Hephaestus's understanding of the cosmic forces that governed both divine and mortal realms, presenting images that encompassed all aspects of existence, from the celestial spheres to the most intimate details of human civilization. The outer ring depicted the constellations that guided navigation and marked the passage of seasons, their positions rendered with astronomical accuracy that demonstrated divine knowledge of celestial mechanics. The sun and moon occupied positions that reflected their actual relationship to Earth and stars, while the constellation patterns matched those visible from the Mediterranean region where the events they illuminated would unfold. The second ring presented scenes of human civilization at its most developed and peaceful, showing 2 cities that represented contrasting approaches to social organization and conflict resolution. The first city celebrated a wedding festival where citizens gathered in elaborate processions that honoured the union of young couples, their clothing and jewellery indicating prosperity that reflected successful agricultural and commercial activities. Musicians played instruments whose sounds seemed to emanate from the bronze surface itself, while dancers moved in patterns that suggested the harmony achievable when human communities functioned according to proper social principles. The wedding feast showed tables laden with food and wine that indicated abundance resulting from effective cooperation between different social classes and occupational groups. The second city depicted the alternative path that human communities might follow when cooperation broke down and conflict replaced negotiation as the primary method for resolving disputes. Armed warriors surrounded the city's walls in siege formations that demonstrated sophisticated military organization, their bronze weapons and layered armour indicating technological advancement that could be directed toward destructive as well as constructive purposes. The besieging forces had established camps that showed their preparation for extended operations, while the defenders manning the walls displayed determination that suggested they would resist until death rather than surrender to enemy demands. The shield's central section presented agricultural scenes that emphasized the fundamental economic activities upon which all human civilization ultimately depended. Ploughmen guided oxen through fields where the bronze surface had been worked to show the actual furrows created by their implements, while the oxen themselves displayed the muscular development that came from years of heavy labour. Reapers worked through grain fields where individual stalks had been rendered with botanical accuracy, their sickles cutting through wheat and barley that represented the successful completion of agricultural cycles that sustained urban populations. The harvest festival that concluded these scenes showed the community celebration that marked the successful gathering of crops that would provide food security through the coming winter months. The pastoral scenes that occupied the shield's fourth ring depicted the animal husbandry that provided meat, dairy products, and raw materials essential for Bronze Age economies. Cattle herds moved across pastures where individual animals displayed the physical characteristics of specific breeds, their movements captured with artistic skill that suggested motion frozen in bronze. Shepherds guided flocks of sheep and goats through mountain valleys where predatory animals posed constant threats that required vigilance and courage from those responsible for protecting valuable livestock. The scenes included dramatic episodes where herders fought off lions and wolves whose attacks could devastate flocks that represented years of careful breeding and management. The innermost ring presented scenes of cultural activities that elevated human existence beyond mere survival to encompass the artistic and social achievements that distinguished civilized communities from barbaric ones. Musicians and dancers performed in elaborate festivals that celebrated religious observances and seasonal transitions, their instruments and costumes indicating the sophisticated craftsmanship that prosperous communities could support. Athletic competitions showed young men engaged in wrestling, boxing, and racing contests that developed physical capabilities while providing entertainment that strengthened community bonds. The artistic quality of these depictions exceeded anything achievable through normal human craftsmanship, creating images that seemed to move and breathe with supernatural life. The completion of this divine armour coincided with the dawn following Patroclus' death, as Thetis emerged from the sea carrying equipment that transformed her son from grief-stricken mourner into an instrument of cosmic vengeance. The sea goddess's approach to the Greek camp created atmospheric disturbances that reflected her supernatural nature, with seabirds crying warnings while waves crashed against the shore in patterns that suggested divine presence. Her silver hair streamed behind her as she moved with the fluid grace that characterized marine deities, while her clothing shifted between the appearance of normal fabric and the flowing transparency of sea foam. The presentation of this divine equipment to Achilles occurred in the presence of the assembled Myrmidons, whose loyalty to their leader had been strengthened rather than weakened by the tragedy that had claimed their beloved Patroclus. The warriors gathered in respectful silence as Thetis laid out each piece of the divine panoply, their bronze surfaces reflecting the morning sunlight in displays of radiance that confirmed their supernatural origin. The corselet's gold inlay work seemed to pulse with inner light, while the helmet's silver decorations created patterns that shifted according to the viewing angle. The shield's artistic program became visible as Achilles lifted it, the bronze surface revealing details that appeared and disappeared as divine craftsmanship interacted with mortal perception. The transformation that occurred as Achilles donned this divine equipment transcended normal changes in appearance that accompanied the assumption of military gear. The corselet moulded itself to his torso with precision that suggested supernatural adjustment to his specific physical characteristics, while its weight seemed to enhance rather than burden his natural movements. The helmet settled onto his head with perfect balance that eliminated the neck strain normally associated with heavy bronze headgear, while its interior padding provided comfort that made extended wear possible without the fatigue that typically limited combat effectiveness. The shield's grip had been crafted to match his hand exactly, creating integration between warrior and equipment that exceeded normal human experience. The The psychological impact of wearing divine armour created changes in Achilles that extended beyond enhanced physical protection to encompass fundamental alterations in his relationship with mortality and fear. The supernatural properties of Hephaestus's craftsmanship provided confidence that transcended normal human limitations, creating awareness that he now possessed capabilities that exceeded those of any mortal opponent. This divine enhancement combined with his natural fighting abilities to produce a warrior whose effectiveness would surpass anything previously witnessed on the battlefields around Troy. The equipment's supernatural properties also served as constant reminders of the cosmic forces that supported his quest for vengeance against those responsible for Patroclus' death. The public ceremony of reconciliation with Agamemnon that preceded Achilles' return to combat reflected the political necessities that governed coalition warfare, while demonstrating the complex relationship between personal honour and collective survival that characterised Bronze Age military culture. The Supreme Commander's recognition that continued conflict with his most effective warrior threatened the entire expedition's survival had forced him to swallow his pride and offer restitution that acknowledged the legitimacy of Achilles' grievances. The formal assembly that witnessed this reconciliation included representatives from all major contingents, their presence providing the public validation that honour codes required for meaningful resolution of disputes between aristocratic equals. Agamemnon's speech accepting responsibility for his previous actions represented a calculated political performance that balanced personal humiliation against strategic necessity. The king of Mycenae acknowledged that divine delusion had clouded his judgment during the dispute over Chryseis, creating circumstances that had led to decisions that violated established protocols governing the treatment of subordinate commanders. His admission that Achilles had been wronged provided the public vindication that honour required, while his offer of substantial compensation demonstrated recognition that mere words could not repair damage that had cost so many Greek lives. The gifts he presented included gold vessels, bronze tripods, thoroughbred horses, and female captives whose value exceeded the original dispute's economic significance. The return of Briseis to Achilles carried symbolic weight that transcended her individual worth as a captive, representing restoration of the respect and recognition that had been violated through Agamemnon's arbitrary confiscation of legitimately won prizes. The young woman's appearance before the assembled army provided visual confirmation that justice had been achieved, while her obvious distress at news of Patroclus' death demonstrated the genuine affection that had developed during her captivity. Her lament for the fallen warrior revealed his kindness toward prisoners and his efforts to provide comfort for those whose lives had been disrupted by the fortunes of war. Achilles' response to this formal reconciliation demonstrated the fundamental changes that grief and divine favour had produced in his character and motivations. His acceptance of Agamemnon's apology and restitution reflected political necessity rather than personal forgiveness, as his primary concern had shifted from vindication of his honour to vengeance for Patroclus' death. The material compensation that had once seemed crucial to his dignity now appeared insignificant compared to the blood debt that Hector's survival represented. His brief acknowledgement of the reconciliation's political importance contrasted sharply with his obvious eagerness to begin the killing that would satisfy his need for revenge. The rejection of food and normal human comforts that characterized Achilles' preparation for battle reflected both his divine heritage and the psychological transformation that grief had produced in his relationship with mortality. His refusal to eat the bread and meat that sustained normal warriors demonstrated transcendence of physical needs that bound ordinary humans to regular cycles of nourishment and rest. The divine blood that flowed through his veins from his sea goddess mother provided sustenance that exceeded mortal requirements, while his supernatural armour offered protection that eliminated the vulnerability that made other warriors cautious about their physical condition before entering combat. This rejection of human needs extended to his dismissal of tactical planning and strategic coordination that normally preceded major military operations. Where other commanders spent hours discussing deployment patterns, supply arrangements, and contingency plans for various battlefield scenarios, Achilles focused entirely on the immediate objective of closing with Hector in personal combat that would settle their blood debt through direct confrontation. His divine enhancement and supernatural equipment had eliminated the uncertainties that made careful preparation essential for mortal warriors, creating confidence that individual prowess could overcome any tactical disadvantage or numerical superiority that enemies might possess. The prophetic knowledge that his participation in Hector's destruction would inevitably lead to his own death added urgency to his preparations while eliminating the survival instincts that normally moderated warrior behaviour in dangerous situations. Thetis had revealed that fate offered him the same choice that had defined his decision to join the Trojan expedition: a brief life crowned with eternal glory or extended existence in comfortable obscurity. His previous selection of fame over longevity had been theoretical, but Patroclus' death had made the consequences immediate and personal. His acceptance of imminent mortality freed him from the caution that preserved life at the cost of limiting achievement, creating a warrior whose effectiveness would be enhanced by complete disregard for personal safety. The marshalling of Greek forces that accompanied Achilles' return to combat created the largest concentration of military power that the coalition had achieved since the war's opening phases. Contingents that had been scattered and demoralised by recent defeats suddenly found their confidence restored by the prospect of fighting alongside the legendary warrior whose absence had contributed to their tactical failures. Unit commanders who had been struggling to maintain discipline among troops facing apparently hopeless odds now discovered renewed enthusiasm for offensive operations that promised decisive results rather than continued defensive attrition. The visual impact of Achilles' appearance in his divine panoply created psychological effects that transcended normal military considerations, inspiring Greek forces while simultaneously terrifying Trojan defenders who recognized that they now faced an opponent whose capabilities exceeded anything they had previously encountered. The bronze surfaces of his supernatural armour reflected sunlight in displays of radiance that suggested divine presence, while the artistic program of his shield proclaimed cosmic forces that supported his quest for vengeance. His mere presence on the battlefield created atmospheric changes that seemed to herald the intervention of supernatural powers in mortal affairs. The Myrmidons who had accompanied their leader into this final battle had been transformed by grief and anticipation into a military instrument whose effectiveness exceeded their already legendary reputation. Their mourning for Patroclus had created bonds of shared loss that strengthened unit cohesion, while generating determination to achieve vengeance that would honour their fallen comrade's memory. Their equipment had been maintained to perfection during their period of inactivity, with bronze spear points sharpened to razor keenness, and armour polished to mirror brightness that would create visual effects coordinated with their leader's supernatural radiance. The tactical deployment that Achilles organised for his return to combat abandoned the careful formations and coordinated manoeuvres that characterised normal Greek military doctrine in favour of direct assault that would maximise the psychological impact of his divine enhancement. His plan emphasised rapid advance that would carry him directly toward the strongest Trojan positions, creating opportunities for personal combat with enemy champions, while demonstrating that Greek forces had regained the tactical initiative that recent defeats had surrendered. The strategy relied on individual prowess rather than collective coordination, reflecting confidence that supernatural capabilities could overcome numerical disadvantages through sheer force of divine favour. The systematic destruction of Trojan forces that followed Achilles' return to combat exceeded even the most optimistic Greek expectations, as the son of Peleus carved a path of devastation through enemy ranks with efficiency that transcended normal human capability. His divine armour deflected bronze spear points that should have found their mark, while his supernatural strength drove his own weapon through shields and corselets that had previously provided adequate protection against mortal opponents. The Scamander River, which had flowed clear for 9 years of intermittent warfare, now ran red with Trojan blood as Achilles methodically eliminated every enemy warrior who dared to face him in direct combat. The psychological impact of this one-sided slaughter created panic throughout Trojan forces that had maintained discipline and tactical coherence throughout years of siege warfare. Warriors who had fought courageously against Greek attacks suddenly found themselves facing an opponent whose capabilities exceeded their understanding of human limitations. The sight of their comrades falling in rapid succession to an enemy who seemed immune to their weapons created morale collapse that spread through Trojan ranks faster than any physical assault could have achieved. Units that had held defensive positions against overwhelming odds began retreating toward the city walls without orders from their commanders, their flight accelerating as Achilles continued his methodical advance through their scattered formations. Hector observed this catastrophic development from his position near Troy's main gate, recognizing that his forces faced complete annihilation unless immediate action could restore their tactical situation. The elder son of Priam understood that conventional military responses would prove inadequate against an opponent whose divine enhancement had eliminated the vulnerabilities that normally allowed skilled defenders to neutralize superior individual prowess. His tactical options had been reduced to a single desperate expedient: personal combat with Achilles that would either eliminate the threat or provide his fleeing warriors with sufficient time to reach the safety of the city's massive fortifications. The decision to face Achilles in single combat represented both military necessity and personal honor that reflected the complex moral obligations governing aristocratic warrior behavior. Hector recognized that his survival might preserve Troy's most effective military commander, but his flight would also destroy the morale and discipline that had sustained Trojan resistance throughout 9 years of siege warfare. The sight of their greatest champion fleeing from combat would convince both his own forces and their enemies that Troy's cause had become hopeless, creating psychological conditions that would make continued resistance impossible, regardless of the city's physical defences. The internal struggle that preceded Hector's final decision revealed the human dimensions of heroic choice that distinguished genuine courage from mere recklessness or desperation. The Trojan prince possessed accurate intelligence about Achilles' enhanced capabilities and understood that direct confrontation would likely result in his own death without achieving corresponding benefits for his city's defence. His knowledge of his opponent's divine armour and supernatural strength suggested that conventional tactics would prove inadequate, while the prophetic warnings he had received indicated that this encounter would determine not only his personal fate, but Troy's ultimate destiny. The sight of Achilles advancing across the battlefield in his radiant panoply created visual effects that seemed to herald divine intervention in mortal affairs. The bronze surfaces of his supernatural armour reflected sunlight in patterns that suggested celestial fire, while his movement generated atmospheric disturbances that made the air shimmer around his divine equipment. His shield's artistic program became visible to observers as he approached, the cosmic scenes depicted on its surface proclaiming the universal forces that supported his quest for vengeance. The horsehair plume of his helmet streamed behind him like a banner of war, its supernatural colours shifting according to lighting conditions in displays that exceeded normal human craftsmanship. The psychological pressure that this apparition created affected even Hector's legendary courage, as the Trojan champion recognised that he faced an opponent whose capabilities transcended normal human limitations. The divine radiance emanating from Achilles' equipment suggested supernatural protection that would render conventional weapons ineffective, while his obvious disregard for tactical caution indicated confidence born of abilities that exceeded mortal understanding. The very air around the approaching figure seemed to vibrate with power that promised destruction for anyone who dared to oppose the cosmic forces that his presence represented. Hector's initial impulse toward flight represented natural human response to supernatural threat, rather than cowardice or tactical weakness. His 3 circuits of Troy's walls, while pursued by the implacable Achilles, created a chase sequence that demonstrated both the speed that divine enhancement had provided the Greek champion and the desperation that had overcome Troy's greatest defender. The pursuit occurred within sight of both armies and the city's population, creating a public spectacle that emphasized the cosmic significance of the confrontation that would determine the war's ultimate outcome. The intervention of divine forces during this chase revealed the complex supernatural politics that continued to influence mortal affairs despite Zeus's earlier prohibition against direct interference. Athena's decision to participate in Hector's deception reflected her commitment to Greek victory, while demonstrating the sophisticated methods that gods employed to circumvent restrictions on their involvement in human conflicts. Her assumption of Deiphobus' appearance provided Hector with the false confidence necessary to turn and face his pursuer, creating the direct confrontation that fate required while maintaining the illusion that divine intervention remained within acceptable limits. The final duel between Achilles and Hector combined tactical sophistication with symbolic significance that elevated their personal combat into a cosmic confrontation between the forces of vengeance and heroic duty. Hector's proposal that the victor should return his opponent's body for proper burial rites reflected his continued adherence to civilized standards of warfare, even when facing an enemy whose behavior had transcended normal human limitations. His recognition that their combat would determine not only individual fates, but the broader moral framework governing relationships between enemies demonstrated the philosophical dimensions that distinguished heroic warfare from mere violence. Achilles' rejection of these civilized constraints revealed the extent to which grief and divine favour had transformed his character beyond normal human limitations. His declaration that no agreements could exist between lions and men, between wolves and lambs, emphasized his psychological identification with predatory forces that recognized no obligations toward their prey. The supernatural enhancement he had received from divine armor and maternal intervention had eliminated the moral restraints that normally governed aristocratic combat, creating a figure whose motivations transcended human understanding while embodying cosmic forces that demanded satisfaction through blood and destruction. The tactical exchange that opened their formal combat demonstrated the exceptional skill that both warriors possessed, despite the supernatural advantages that favoured Achilles. Hector's spear cast showed the precision that had made him legendary throughout both armies, his bronze point striking the centre of his opponent's divine shield with force that should have achieved penetration against normal equipment. The weapon's failure to breach Hephaestus' supernatural craftsmanship confirmed Trojan fears about the divine protection that supported their enemy, while simultaneously revealing the futility of conventional tactics against opponents who enjoyed celestial favour. Achilles' response demonstrated both his enhanced physical capabilities and the tactical intelligence that complemented his supernatural advantages. His spear thrust exploited the single vulnerable point in Hector's armour, the gap between helmet and corselet that protected the throat while allowing necessary flexibility for head movement. The bronze point penetrated flesh and windpipe with surgical precision that reflected both divine guidance and the exceptional training that had made him legendary even before his supernatural enhancement. The wound proved immediately fatal while avoiding damage to vocal cords that would prevent the dying speeches that heroic protocol required. Hector's final words revealed the prophetic knowledge that often accompanied approaching death, as he warned Achilles that his own destruction would follow shortly after this moment of triumph. The dying Trojan's prediction that Paris and Apollo would bring down the seemingly invincible Greek champion demonstrated the cyclical nature of vengeance that governed heroic warfare, where each act of violence created obligations that demanded corresponding retaliation. His request for honourable treatment of his corpse reflected continued faith in civilized values, even as he recognised that his opponent had transcended normal human moral constraints. The desecration of Hector's body that followed his death represented Achilles' complete abandonment of the heroic codes that normally govern treatment of fallen enemies. His decision to drag the corpse behind his chariot in full view of Troy's walls violated fundamental religious and social obligations that distinguish civilized warfare from barbaric violence. The systematic abuse of Hector's remains during the following days demonstrated how grief and divine enhancement had corrupted the moral framework that had previously defined Achilles' character, transforming him from heroic champion into an instrument of cosmic vengeance that recognized no limits on its destructive power. The daily ritual of corpse abuse that Achilles established created a spectacle of systematic degradation that horrified observers on both sides of the conflict. Each morning he would harness Hector's body to his chariot and drag it 3 times around Patroclus' tomb, the bronze wheels and horses' hooves reducing the once magnificent warrior to a mangled mass of flesh and bone. The divine protection that Apollo provided prevented complete dissolution of the corpse while allowing sufficient damage to demonstrate the depth of Achilles' rage and his rejection of civilized constraints on vengeful behavior. The psychological impact of this desecration extended far beyond its immediate effect on Trojan morale to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between divine favor and moral obligation. Greek warriors who had celebrated Hector's death as justified vengeance for Patroclus' killing began questioning whether their champion's behaviour violated religious laws that governed proper treatment of the dead. The sight of systematic corpse abuse created unease that challenged assumptions about divine approval for actions that exceeded normal human understanding of justice and appropriate retaliation. The gods themselves responded to this violation of cosmic order with interventions that demonstrated their concern about mortal behaviour that threatened fundamental principles governing relationships between human and divine realms. Apollo's protection of Hector's corpse from complete destruction represented divine recognition that some boundaries could not be crossed without challenging the moral framework that made civilized existence possible. The preservation of the body's essential form despite systematic abuse provided evidence that supernatural forces maintained standards that exceeded human understanding while protecting values that transcended individual desires for vengeance. Zeus's growing concern about the cosmic implications of Achilles' behaviour culminated in divine intervention designed to restore proper relationships between victors and vanquish that civilized warfare required. The king of the gods recognized that unlimited vengeance could destabilize the moral order that governed both divine and human realms, creating precedents that might justify behavior that threatened fundamental principles of justice and restraint. His decision to mandate Hector's return to Troy for proper burial rites represented cosmic authority asserting control over mortal actions that had exceeded acceptable limits. The divine message that Thetis delivered to her son combined maternal concern with celestial command that could not be refused without risking consequences that might extend beyond individual punishment to encompass cosmic disruption. The sea goddess's warning that continued abuse of Hector's corpse would forfeit divine favour that had made Achilles' vengeance possible demonstrated the conditional nature of supernatural support that required adherence to moral principles even during moments of supreme triumph. Her revelation that Zeus himself demanded restoration of proper burial rites provided authority that transcended personal grief, while offering opportunities for redemption through actions that honoured civilized values. Priam's decision to undertake the dangerous journey to the Greek camp represented both paternal desperation and royal courage that transcended normal considerations of personal safety and political wisdom. The aged king's recognition that diplomatic appeals through normal channels would prove futile had forced him to adopt extraordinary measures that violated conventional protocols governing relationships between enemies during active warfare. His willingness to enter hostile territory where his capture would provide enemies with invaluable political advantages demonstrated the depth of parental love while embodying the royal obligations that required personal sacrifice for the welfare of his people. The preparation for this nocturnal mission required careful planning that balanced stealth requirements against the ceremonial dignity that Priam's royal status demanded, even during desperate circumstances. His selection of appropriate gifts reflected both practical considerations about what might motivate Greek acceptance of his appeal and symbolic recognition of Hector's value that transcended normal ransom calculations. The gold vessels, silver tripods, and precious fabrics that filled his wagon represented Troy's accumulated wealth, while providing tangible evidence of the price that royal grief was prepared to pay for the privilege of honouring a beloved son. The supernatural assistance that Hermes provided during Priam's journey demonstrated divine sympathy for parental suffering that transcended the political alignments that normally determined celestial support for mortal causes. The messenger god's intervention reflected recognition that some human experiences, particularly parental grief, created moral obligations that exceeded the partisan considerations governing divine involvement in warfare between competing mortal factions. His guidance through Greek defensive positions and his protection from hostile sentries enabled Priam's mission, while maintaining the illusion that success resulted from human courage rather than supernatural intervention. The encounter between Priam and Achilles in the latter's tent created one of ancient literature's most profound explorations of shared humanity that could bridge even the deepest divisions created by warfare and personal loss. The age's king's prostration before his son's killer represented both diplomatic protocol and genuine humiliation that demonstrated the extent of paternal devotion while appealing to whatever remained of civilized behavior in an opponent who had transcended normal moral constraints. His appeal combined practical offers of substantial ransom with emotional arguments that emphasized common experiences of loss that connected all human beings regardless of their political allegiances. The transformation that occurred in Achilles during this encounter revealed the persistence of human compassion beneath the supernatural enhancement and consuming rage that had defined his recent behaviour. Priam's reminder of his own father Peleus and the inevitable grief that his death would cause created emotional connections that transcended the immediate circumstances of their meeting, while restoring awareness of moral obligations that extended beyond personal vengeance. The sight of an enemy king's tears for his beloved son awakened corresponding memories of his own relationship with Patroclus, while demonstrating the universal nature of parental love that warfare could not ultimately destroy. The mutual recognition of shared suffering that emerged from their conversation created temporary suspension of the hostilities that had defined their relationship while revealing the common humanity that connected all participants in the tragic events surrounding Troy. Both men had lost beloved companions whose deaths had created obligations that exceeded normal human understanding, while both faced futures that promised additional suffering regardless of their current conflict's ultimate resolution. Their ability to acknowledge these parallels while maintaining their fundamental opposition demonstrated the complex moral landscape that heroic warfare created for its participants. The agreement to return Hector's body in exchange for appropriate ransom represented more than simple commercial transaction to encompass recognition of civilized values that transcended immediate political and military considerations. Achilles' acceptance of Priam's gold and silver demonstrated restoration of moral constraints that had been abandoned during his period of unlimited vengeance, while his promise to honour the truce required for proper funeral rites showed renewed respect for religious obligations that governed relationships between enemies. The negotiation of specific terms for the cessation of hostilities revealed both leaders' understanding that some human experiences required temporary suspension of warfare, regardless of their strategic implications. The shared meal that concluded their meeting created symbolic communion that temporarily transformed enemies into guests bound by sacred obligations of hospitality that governed civilized relationships throughout the ancient world. Their consumption of bread and wine together represented mutual recognition of common humanity, while providing tangible evidence that civilized behavior remained possible even between those whose political positions made them irreconcilable opponents. The ritual significance of this shared nourishment extended beyond immediate diplomatic necessity to encompass restoration of moral frameworks that made meaningful human relationships possible despite the destructive forces that warfare inevitably unleashed. Priam's safe return to Troy with his son's body created opportunities for the elaborate funeral rites that would provide appropriate closure for both Trojan grief and the immediate cycle of vengeance that had consumed both armies since Patroclus' death. The 12-day truce that accompanied these ceremonies allowed both sides to honour their dead while providing breathing space that demonstrated the temporary nature of even the most intense human conflicts. The The funeral pyre that consumed Hector's remains marked the end of Troy's greatest defender, while simultaneously beginning the final phase of a siege that would culminate in the city's complete destruction. The funeral games that honoured Hector's memory provided Troy's population with final opportunities to celebrate the heroic values that their champion had embodied throughout his life and military career. The athletic competitions, musical performances, and ceremonial displays that mark these observances demonstrated the cultural achievements that made Troy worth defending while creating lasting memories that would preserve Hector's reputation regardless of his city's ultimate fate. The participation of citizens from all social classes in these commemorative activities revealed the universal respect that the fallen prince had earned through his dedication to protecting his people against foreign invasion. The prophetic knowledge that informed both Trojan and Greek understanding of these events created awareness that Hector's funeral marked not merely the end of individual life, but the beginning of Troy's final destruction. The temporary truce that allowed proper burial rites would inevitably expire, returning both armies to warfare that could only conclude with the complete elimination of one side or the other. The wooden horse stratagem that would ultimately breach Troy's defences remained in the future, but the death of the city's greatest defender had created conditions that made such desperate expedients both necessary and potentially successful. The restoration of proper relationships between divine and mortal realms that resulted from Hector's honourable burial demonstrated the cosmic significance of maintaining civilized standards even during the most extreme circumstances that warfare could create. The gods' approval of Achilles' decision to honour Priam's appeal revealed divine recognition that some human values transcended immediate political considerations while providing moral frameworks that preserved meaning and dignity even in the face of inevitable destruction. The temporary suspension of supernatural partisanship that accompanied these funeral rites suggested possibilities for reconciliation that extended beyond immediate military concerns to encompass fundamental questions about justice, mercy, and the proper limits of vengeance. The psychological transformation that both Achilles and Priam experienced through their encounter created lasting changes that would influence their remaining time before fate claimed them both. The Greek champion's restoration of moral constraints that had been abandoned during his period of unlimited vengeance provided redemption that preserved his heroic status while demonstrating the possibility of maintaining civilized behaviour even under extreme emotional pressure. The Trojan king's successful completion of his dangerous mission provided personal satisfaction while establishing precedents for honourable conduct that would guide his city's behaviour during its final desperate months of resistance. The broader implications of these events extended far beyond their immediate impact on the siege of Troy to encompass fundamental questions about human nature, divine justice, and the proper relationships between individual desire and collective welfare that would influence Western moral thinking for millennia. The demonstration that even the most consuming grief and rage could be tempered by recognition of shared humanity provided hope that civilized values might survive even the most destructive conflicts, while the gods' intervention to restore proper burial rites affirmed cosmic support for moral principles that transcended immediate political considerations. The temporary peace that followed Hector's funeral created the final calm before the storm that would ultimately destroy Troy and claim the lives of most participants in this legendary conflict. Achilles would soon fall to Paris's arrow guided by Apollo, fulfilling the prophecy that had defined his choice between long life and eternal glory. Priam would witness his city's destruction and die at the altar of Zeus, while the few Trojan survivors would scatter across the Mediterranean to establish new homes far from their ancestral land. The wooden horse that would breach Troy's defences remained Odysseus's future inspiration, but the foundations for that final stratagem had been laid through the recognition of shared humanity that emerged from the meeting between grieving father and vengeful warrior in the shadow of inevitable doom.